Hey there, my name is Zach and I wanted to welcome you to the CSS Grid course. Now this course is a combination of a bunch of videos that I have on my channel, but all of those videos have been sequenced in order from start to finish of learning this topic. So I've just consolidated it here because a lot of people have asked me to do that into one video. And this video is meant to be totally comprehensive. So as long as you've got some background in HTML and CSS, this should take you from a total beginner with CSS Grid, and it'll teach you not only what is CSS Grid and why it's useful, but also how it compares to Flexbox and how to use it in general. CSS Grid is awesome for creating complex layouts in your browser, and I use it all the time on different work projects and personal projects. So it's well worth the watch. I wish you luck learning it, and I'll see you in the video.
In this mini course, we will be trying to cover pretty much everything you need to know about CSS Grid. And by the end of it, I want you to be able to explain what Grid is, understand all the basic syntax, so I'll show you that in a second, and most importantly, understand how we can take CSS Grid and Flexbox and use them together. Many web devs, including my former self, think that CSS Grid and Flexbox are incompatible. They compete with each other. And that's not true. There is a great use case for both of them in the same project, and hopefully by the end of this mini course, you're going to see exactly how that happens. We're going to cover all of these properties. There's a lot here, and I know it's overwhelming, but I promise you, if you have a little bit of a background in Flexbox from that previous tutorial, once again, please watch that before diving into this course. But if you have that prerequisite knowledge, this is not going to be impossible. I'm going to walk you through every single property here, and we're going to lay it out in a very logical structure so you can kind of group these into your head. As you can see, just like Flexbox, we have the concept of a container and that container's children elements. So with Flexbox, it was the Flex container and Flex items. Here we're talking about the Grid container and Grid items. Each of these properties here are going to either apply to the container level or the item level, and they're also going to either pertain to sizing or alignment. So I promise you it's not quite as hard as it looks here. To add to the confusion though, this is where CSS gets a little bit difficult. With most CSS properties, there are shorthand properties that we can use to express the same thing in less lines of code. In my personal opinion, shorthand properties, unless they're like very basic shorthand properties like the padding property, are not meant for beginners to start working with. We've got to understand the framework first, and then we can start layering in that efficiency that comes from using these shorthand CSS properties. Let me give you a very quick example. If we go back to the first page, these are the ones that we are going to cover, and we look up into the top right with the grid container sizing properties. You'll see that we have grid template rows and grid template columns. Now if we go to the next slide, these are the shorthand properties. You will see those, so grid template columns and grid template rows. Those can be kind of summarized and wrapped up in several shorthand properties. So we can either use the grid property, which pretty much defines the whole grid all in one property. It's pretty confusing if you're a beginner. Or we can use something like grid template, which does something similar but doesn't quite do everything at once. So throughout the CSS Grid course, you obviously have all of these properties available to you, and you might be watching and say, why are you writing 4 lines when you could write 1? There's a very good reason for that. It's really hard to learn a framework and learn the shortcuts at the same time, so we're going to instead just do everything longhand and do our best to learn the framework, and then you can start to tack on all that efficiency later. I promise we're about to get into the lesson, but I really want to talk about why we're using this in the first place. Why would I spend an entire course to talk about CSS Grid? To someone who's been developing web applications since the early 2000s or even earlier, it's very apparent why CSS Grid makes sense. Now, I myself have not been coding for that long. It's been about 5 years at this point. But even for me, I've gone through some of the pains of the pre-grid era of CSS, and it's a little bit painful to create web applications without it. So let's briefly go way back. So prior to 2009, this is when Flexbox came out. I think my facts are right on that. But we pretty much had hacky solutions galore when it came to CSS layouts. So if you wanted to make a fixed nav bar and a fixed side nav bar and a side element and then main content and a footer, just like that Holy Grail layout, it was extremely difficult to do, and you had to use, floats and clear fixes and all sorts of solutions that were never meant to happen when CSS was created. From 2009 to 2017, so this is before Grid was released, but Flexbox was in the picture, everything got a lot easier. You could make a lot more predictable layouts. But since Flexbox is one-dimensional, there was still a little bit of a pain point for front-end developers, especially when you wanted to create literally a grid and you wanted all the items to have determinate, widths and heights. So in 2017, all of the web browsers kind of in unison just had support enabled for CSS Grid. So Grid was released, and from that point forward, designing layouts for the web, of course after learning CSS Grid in the system and how it works and stuff, became a lot easier. If you learn this framework, you can create CSS layouts that actually make intuitive sense. So previously you've got all these hacks going on and you're like, why does this element do this that way? But now it's very determinate. You can explicitly state how everything should be laid out on the page, and you're not going to get a whole lot of unexpected behaviors. For some, it's good enough to take my word for it and just go ahead and learn CSS Grid. For others, you may have to go through that pain. You may be a little bit stubborn. I'm kind of like that myself, where you have to go through and understand the background and try to make layouts without CSS Grid before you're going to really recognize the value in what we're learning here. So if you're still here watching this video, which according to my YouTube stats, most of you will not be here still, thank you for sticking around, and it also means that you're probably sold on the idea of learning CSS Grid. Now there's just one thing I want to talk about before we really dive in, and that is browser support. Probably most of you won't care about this, but if you happen to have stumbled on this video and you also happen to support Internet Explorer and a couple other old versions of certain browsers in your day job, you have to know that CSS Grid is not supported fully in all browsers. Once again, very few people will have to deal with this, but if you do deal with this, you'll come into your CSS, you'll put an @supports rule, and you'll type display grid, and then you put all of your styles here related to Grid. So this rule will basically check for you and say, hey, does this browser support CSS Grid? If so, apply all of these grid rules. If this rule does apply to you and you actually have to support older browsers, I want to thank you for your service. It's honest work to support Internet Explorer these days. For this tutorial, we're going to get rid of this though. I don't want to deal with this. There's enough to learn with CSS Grid already, so I'm not going to deal with that. To get us started, I've pasted in some HTML and CSS. Very basic, and if you watched the Flexbox course like I told you to before coming to this course, you know exactly what we're looking at here. We're looking at a container and then list of child elements. With Flexbox, you've got the Flex container and the Flex items. With CSS Grid, you have the grid container and the grid items. So every direct child to a grid container is going to be a grid item. And just like Flexbox, to enable the grid system, you come into the container itself, you type in display grid. So now this top level container here is a CSS Grid container. As we've talked about many times, a single property like the display property literally changes all the rules of the game for all of the other elements once you do it. It's no different here. We now have all of these grid items abiding by the CSS Grid system rules. And those rules are what we're going to cover here. Before we get any further with these properties, I want to give you that 10,000 foot view of CSS Grid. So really the difference between Flexbox and CSS Grid is 1D versus 2D. So flexbox goes in one dimension, and we talked about how the flex direction is either row or column, which defines the main and the cross axis within your flexbox container. With CSS Grid, it's a little bit different because we have two dimensions. We have the horizontal and the vertical direction, and we actually have properties to control the sizing and the alignment of the elements on both of these dimensions, which we kind of call tracks. As you can see in the visual here, I've just labeled a couple of these. So we've got a vertical track number 1, so this would be the first column, and then a horizontal track number 1, which would be the first row. And as you can see, this grid comes with grid lines, and then between the grid lines are going to be what we call the grid area. What we can do with CSS Grid is we can take the grid items themselves and we can define, looking at these lines that we've laid out in the template that we've created, we can define where those items are going to be placed and how big they are. So for example, this first item, number 1, we have put it between row number 1 and row number 2, and between column number 1 and column number 3. This is obviously a 3x3 grid, so you have 9 total little grid cells. So this number 1 item is going to be 2 little cells wide and 1 cell tall. Now if you look at number 3 over here, we are placing this between column 3 and column 4 and making it 3 cells high. So you can see that we will actually be able to do this really easily with just a few CSS rules. Prior to CSS Grid, this would be a nightmare to try to create using the built-in CSS properties. So as we go through the properties, I want to show you 2 great cheat sheets that you can have open. I would definitely recommend picking one, using both, having them available to you as you're learning or using CSS Grid for the first couple of weeks. So the first one here, and both of these are going to be in the description below, so don't worry about the links here. You can find those easily. Here's the first one. This is just a very high-level view of all of the properties for Grid. So you've got the container properties and the children properties down here, and it gives you just a very small little visual of what they do. Now, looking at this firsthand, it's not going to make any sense. So we'll walk through how this all works, and then this cheat sheet will become very helpful to you. There's also this one here, which is a little less structured in terms of summary, but it gives you a lot of interactive ways to work with Grid. So we can come here and just click on different configurations and see what those do just to experiment out with them. So 2 really great cheat sheets, links in the description, have them open after this course when you're building with Grid. So the first thing that we need to do here is give ourselves a little playground that we can use to explore the different properties of CSS Grid. Now in previous tutorials I've just kind of set up that playground, but at this point in the Full Stack Roadmap series you should be getting very comfortable with HTML and CSS. For that reason, we're going to actually construct our little playground together. The first thing that we're always going to do when we start a CSS style sheet is a little reset. So we're going to target every single element on our page. We're going to remove all the margin from it. We're going to remove all the padding from it. And most importantly, we're going to change the box sizing to be border box so that the width and the height that we set to our elements is actually going to be the width and the height of those elements. If this makes no sense to you, you might want to review the CSS Basics video that I created. I'm also going to add a little bit of padding on the body element. So we're just going to give it 2% padding, and that's going to just bring in our elements here so that they're not just pushed up against the edge. We've already got a rule for our grid container, and these are actually already grid items, but I want to put this as an explicit width and height. So we'll give it a width of 310 pixels, and we're going to give it a height of the same, so a perfect square. And you might wonder why we're doing 310 pixels. It's going to become very apparent here in a second. I want to also give it a border. It's going to be 5 pixels, solid, and we're going to give it a nice little color theme. So let me get my color here, like a dark green. So there's our grid container, very explicit how we're defining this, and it will give us a very nice template to work with. Now just a quick review, the reason why I put a width of 310 and a height of 310 is because we have this 5 pixel border. So when we have box sizing of border box, the width and the height of the elements are going to be the inner content plus the padding plus the border. Not the margin, margin doesn't count here, but those three things are going to create that width and the height. And therefore, if we define our grid container at 310 pixels with a 5 pixel border, that means that on both the horizontal and vertical sides, we have a total of 5 plus 5 or 10 pixels of border. And that leaves us with 300 by 300 of empty space to work with within our container. If you don't believe me, I'll prove it. Let's open up the DevTools. We'll select one of the elements and you can see this grid item has a width of 300 pixels. So that's how we got to that. I just wanted an even number to work with so that we're not doing complex calculations. The next thing I want to do is style our grid items. Right now they just have numbers in there, but we can do a little bit better. So let's add another class here. So we'll say GI1 and then we'll paste that down to the other ones and replace that with 1, 2, and 3. So we have 3 selectors for our class, and then we'll go down and make a couple of rules for that. I'm going to do the first one as our template, and then we'll just replace as we go. So the first one will be 1E4040 as a color, and the background color is going to be 71D99E. All right. So there's our first one. Then we can just copy this rule 1, 2 times, replace these classes to target these next 2 elements, and then we will change the color, which I'll spare you watching me do that. All right, we're done with the colors. Now we just need to center these numbers and make them a little bit bigger so that we can see it. A great way to do this is using Flexbox. So we're not getting into Grid quite yet, but we can already start to see how using Grid and Flexbox together is very possible and it's really helpful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these grid items and these are going to become Flex containers. So yes, they are grid items and Flex containers at the same exact time. To target them all at once, we'll use their shared class of grid item. Come to the bottom here, type out grid item, and we'll say display flex. And once we do that, we can use these align items center and justify content center to put those numbers right in the middle. We just need to make it a little bigger now, so we'll give it a font weight of say 800. It'll make those numbers a little bit thicker, and then we'll say the font size is going to be 2 rem units. And by default, if we come up here to the HTML and set the font size to 16 pixels, which is pretty much the browser default anyway, that means when we set the 2 rem that it's going to be 200% of the root element font size, which is 16 pixels. So do 16 times 200%, and that's how big these fonts are. Now as we go along, I'm going to be popping up some pictures that allow us to see better what's going on within our HTML and CSS. Another way that we can look at this, we can always open the developer tools, and if you hover over this grid, you're going to actually see some grid lines. So you see those dotted lines around the container, that is the grid that we're dealing with right now. Now I'm using Google Chrome because I wanted to have my Google Slides up for the earlier part of the presentation, but I just opened the same thing up in Firefox, and you'll see when you inspect the element within Firefox, there's an even better representation of grid, at least in my opinion. So if you click here and then you drop down the grid section, and then kind of hover over this grid container, you can really start to see everything come to life. So quite honestly, if you're doing this, kind of coding along with me, go ahead and use Firefox. It's a much better developer tool environment for CSS Grid. Throughout the tutorial, we'll dig into these little developer tools, and I guess quite honestly, I could probably just use Firefox for the rest of this tutorial. I think that's what I'm going to do so that we have these excellent developer tools at our disposal. So our basic grid template What you're looking at right here can be represented by this little visual here. So by default, we haven't really done anything other than just enable the grid with the display grid property. But what that will do is automatically create what you're seeing here. So you have one vertical track, so just one column, and then you have 3 horizontal tracks. And what these are actually called, this is actually called an implicit grid, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically you have, once again, you have the lines that the grid items kind of are spaced between. And if you come back to our Firefox developer tools, so let's inspect this element. Here's our grid on the left. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And then if we click, so let's collapse the box model. We don't need Flexbox. So you can see on the left, as we hover over grid here and click this button, you can see that the container is highlighted, and we have each of these rows kind of highlighted within the developer tools. Then we can also click display line numbers, and you can see that we have line number 1 and line number 2. Now, if you're like me, when I'm learning and I see something that doesn't make sense, it irritates me. One of those things here is that there's negative numbers on the grid as lines. We will come back to these negative numbers, but for now, just look over them, don't worry about them. They basically just represent the end of the grid from a row and column perspective, and it allows you to size your items starting from the end of the grid rather than the beginning. Rest assured though, we will come back to this. For now, just only think in positive numbers. We can also add area names. That's not going to show us anything right now, but we will talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, extend lines indefinitely or infinitely. I like this. It just kind of gives you a nice framework to look at this grid. So in my opinion, checking all of the boxes is going to give you the best view for your grid, and that's what we're going to do throughout the tutorial. Like I said, at the moment, we only have the grid enabled. We don't have any grid properties set. So right here, grid container, we said display grid. Since all of this stuff is just general styling, what I'm going to do is break out our grid styles and properties up above and then put these below so we don't have to worry about them. So in CSS, as we know, since it's cascading and it reads it top to bottom, we can define a single CSS rule 2 times. So we can bring this display grid up here, and even though these are the same rules, it's going to first apply this and then apply these remaining styles. So pretty much everything below here is general styling, also flexbox styling. So we will just enter that all down so we can really focus on what's going on. And then I guess all of this stuff applies to that as well. So let's put that down in the general styling also. Let's open up Firefox DevTools once again. We've got a clean slate to work with, and what I've done here is just opened up our view here so that we have the Firefox DevTools over here on the right, opened up to the grid view, and then we've selected the grid container. This other one's actually just built into the CodePen environment. They have a grid going on behind the scenes. We just want to click grid container, and you can see that it highlights the grid that we have created. The first 2 properties we're going to talk about is the explicit structure of the grid. So how many rows and columns do you want? These 2 properties are grid template rows and grid template columns. We'll start off by being extremely explicit and telling it exactly how much width and height to occupy. So we'll say grid template rows, and for the rows, that's going to be, top to bottom, so kind of the vertical definition here. And what I want to say is 20 pixels, 20 pixels, and 20 pixels. What you'll see is, or actually let's make this a little bigger so the numbers fit. So we'll go 50, not 500. We'll go 50, 50, and 50. And you could, of course, change this to anything you want. So you could put 80 for the last one, and it defines the row differently. Since we've set these rows explicitly, you can see our grid over here on the right has changed a little bit, and accordingly on the left. Now we can add our grid template columns, and we can be just as explicit. So maybe we say we want the first column to be 30 pixels, then 50 pixels, and another 50 pixels or something like that. So after doing that, in the top left corner, there's kind of some madness going on there. I'll explain that in a second. But if we look at our grid definition down here in the bottom right, you can see that our definition right here for the rows and columns is exactly as we defined. So you just space out the arguments, and each additional argument represents an additional row or column. The reason this is all looking weird is because we just haven't given it enough space. So if we open up the CodePen editor here and we come down to the body and give it, I don't know, something like 7% padding and just allow it to space out, you'll see that the grid line definitions are showing a little bit more clearly. We'll keep this setting so that we can see it as we go. More commonly than defining explicit pixel values for our rows and columns, you're going to see something called a fractional unit. So let's get back to our original grid that we were looking at, kind of the default grid, which would have been 3 rows and 1 column. So if we wanted 1 column, all we have to do is delete all these arguments and put in just one value. So we'll say 100 pixels. And you can see that we just have that 1 column here, and if we click on the grid on the right, here's the grid that we're working with. To get back to our original example, we don't want 100 pixels, we want 1 fractional unit. And what this FR unit kind of represents is very similar to what we talked about with the flex grow and flex shrink properties back in the Flexbox course. So if you remember in the Flexbox course, if we had flex items that didn't take the entire space of their flex container, there was what we call empty space. And we had to allocate out units to those flex items to determine how much empty space they would occupy. The fractional unit here is doing pretty much the same thing. So right now, for our column width, we're saying we want to give 1 column, and it's going to equal 1 fractional unit. So basically, there's only 1 fractional unit to allocate, so that's 100% of the width of the grid container. If we came in here and put another column, you're going to see that it's perfectly equal because now we have a total grid container, which we know is 300 pixels wide because we created it, and we're giving the first column 1 FR and the second 1 FR. So there's 2 total fractional units, and if you take 300 divided by 2, you get 150. So each of these are going to be 150 pixels wide. You can see that as I hover over them. So that's what a fractional unit is, and we're going to set this back to 1 fractional unit, so we have 1 column. And now instead of these explicit pixel values, I'm going to say 1 FR, 1 FR, and 1 FR. And that gets us back to our original view that we had, and it's going to say I want to have 3 total rows and give it 3 fractional units. So if the height is 300 pixels, that's 300 divided by 3, and whatever that value is going to equal the height of each of these items. So what we've said here is we want 3 columns, and each of those columns is going to be 1 fractional unit. There's 3 total fractional units allocated within the row dimension. So 300 pixels tall divided by 3 fractional units is 100 pixels each. To give us a little bit of space to work with and some interesting calculations, let's make our grid a little bit more complex. Not actually more complex, just more grid cells to work with. So I'm going to create an 8x8 grid. So I need 8 of these 1 FR units to equally space those out. So what I can do is just type them all out. Let's copy and paste 4 more in there. And now you can see that we have lines 1 through 9, and this is kind of the fence post problem where you're counting how many fence posts you have versus how many sections of the fence you have. So we have 8 sections of that fence, or 8 rows, but we have 9, fence posts, or 9 lines to go by. To get an equal amount of columns, you would do the same thing down here in the grid template columns. So now we're going to have a grid that is 8 by 8 or 64 individual little grid cells. I know I said that I would not teach a whole lot of shorthand CSS or shortcuts or stuff like anything like that, but in this case I'm going to, because nobody wants to type out all of this stuff at once. There is a better way to do this, and all we have to do is use the repeat function within CSS. We haven't really talked a whole lot about CSS functions, but this is one that you can just kind of memorize just to have in your toolkit. So what we're going to do is we're going to repeat whatever unit 8 times, and then we'll put in a comma, and we're going to give it 1 FR, which means we're going to repeat 1 FR 8 times just like we have down here. So this right here is perfectly equivalent to this right here. And we can go ahead and copy this one down to the columns as well, since we have a perfectly square 8 by 8 grid, and we get the same result. Just as a spot check, you can now see your grid down here. So we have 8 by 8 or 64 total little grid cells, and you can highlight each of them and kind of play around with them. We have learned the basic tenets of CSS Grid, why we need it, and how to explicitly define the grid that we want to work with. So we have this 8 by 8 grid down here in the bottom right corner of our Firefox DevTools. And our next challenge is to figure out how do we take each of these grid items and place them on different parts of this grid. We can do this with the grid row start, grid row end, grid column start, and grid column end CSS properties. We'll start with the rows. So let's say that we wanted to put this first item down 1, the second one we'll put it second to bottom, and the third one we'll put it at the very bottom. In order to do that, we just come to the individual grid items. So now we're kind of flipping from a grid container level property to an item level property. So we're going to select grid item 1 and then 2 and 3. So we'll replace that with a 3 and then a 2. And we'll start with the rows. So we'll say grid row start. And in this case, we have our lines already defined for us using the Firefox DevTools. So really helpful tool to have open. And we want to put this first one in this little sector for the row. So we want to start it at line number 2 and end it at line number 3. So we'll put in 2 there for the start, copy that down, and put end and replace that with 3. And now we have number 1 sitting down there in that spot. We said we wanted number 2 to be second from the end and 3 to be at the very end. So all we have to do is look at these row lines and place them there. So 2 will start at 7, end at 8, and 3 will start at 8 and end at 9. So we can just copy these grid row start and end properties down to these items. As you can see, they have already moved a little bit, but let's replace these and put it between 7 and 8, 8 and 9. So we've got our grid items on the rows that we want. Now we have to define which columns we want them in. So we'll keep the first one here. We'll just leave it. And we can actually define that explicitly, even though it's already there. So we'll say grid column start is going to be 1 because we're starting at the first column here. And then grid column end is going to be 2 because it ends at column 2. Now for this one, let's say that we want second to last column, and then likewise with the bottom one, we'll go with the last column. So we can just copy these properties in again. So for number 2, it starts at column 7, ends at 8. So we'll replace those numbers. You can see that jumped over there. And then finally, the third item will be between 8 and 9. So now we have placed our grid items explicitly on our 8x8 grid. So you know how to place the items, but how do we size them? What if we wanted these to be larger or smaller? Well, there's really two ways that I can think of off the top of my head. The first one is just explicitly defining the width and height of those items. So this is nothing to do with grid. This is just basic CSS. Let's say we came down to grid item number 1 and we gave it a width of 200 pixels. You'll see that that extends out and our grid gets collapsed in a very weird way. And I don't want to get into this quite yet because we're just not there yet. So we're not going to use this width and height properties on our grid items. We're going to keep our grid intact, and we're going to use these row start, row end, column start, and column end properties to size our items. So what if we wanted to take this first item and make it the full width of this container, the grid container? All we have to do here is go to the columns, because we're talking about what column does it start and end at. And I'm going to start it at column 1, end it at the last column, which is column 9. So all I have to do is change the 2 to a 9, and this item is now the full width of our grid container. This starts to get fun once you realize how easy it is. So let's say we wanted number 2 to extend right up to that number 1. So we'll start it at row 3, and we'll end it at the same one, so 8. So we'll come down to grid item 2. It starts at 3 and ends at 8. And now that's going to extend up and push up against that final one. And then maybe we'll make number 3 3 little grid cells wide. So we will start it at column, looks like column 6, and end it at 9. So start it at 6, end it at 9, and now we have that extending out. Now here's where those negative numbers come in. I know they've been probably bothering a few of you. I know that I would have been bothered looking at these. But let's say that we have a grid and we don't really want to calculate, how many items are in the grid. And, for this grid item number 3, it starts at 6 and ends at 9. And that's just kind of hard to deal with in our heads because it's just like these numbers are just kind of arbitrary, it seems like. So what we could do is, instead of saying it starts at 6, ends at 9, we could say we just want to start it at the very end of the grid, and we want to end it 3 units to the left of the end of the grid. So what we can do here is we can come to the grid column start, and instead of using 6 right here, we're kind of reversing everything. So now we're going from right to left. We're going to start it at -1, which means we're going to start it at the very end of that grid. And then we're going to end it at -4, and that's going to extend it into the same little section that we had before. So if we know our grid is 8x8, we always know that -1 is going to represent the end of a row or column, and then we can just backtrack and say how many little grid cells that we want it to be. The next thing we're going to cover, and this is really important, is something called a grid area, and the concept of giving a width and height to a grid item. Let's get rid of a few things here. I'm going to remove all the styles from all of these grid items. And then I'm also going to comment out those last 2 grid items. So now we just have 1 sitting in our grid. When it refreshes, and let's get that grid outline back. Now, if you remember what I said, when we give a width to grid item number 1 of 100 pixels, the whole grid is going to move. And that is because an individual grid cell is 37.5 pixels wide, and we're giving it 100 pixels wide, so it's kind of stretching outside of its predefined grid area. How do I know this dimension? Well, if you go to the console and you just type in 300 divided by 8, because there's 8 total grid items, wide and tall, you get 37.5. And you can even check that if you come back. Let me get rid of this for a second. I'll remove that explicit width off of this. So now we have this little normal sized item, and it's 37.5 by 37.5, as you can see highlighted there. Let's experiment around with this a little bit though. I think you'll start to understand it better once we get a bigger grid area to work with. So I want to fill up this entire space here. So I'll go to this grid down here. So starting in this little grid cell, going all the way down to here. So it'll be a 3 by 3 kind of grid area within our bigger grid. So to do that, we'll go to our lone grid item and we'll say grid row start is going to be number 2. So we'll put in 2. Grid row end is going to be 5, I believe, so that we can get 3 units. And then the column is going to be just indented 1. So we'll start it at 2 and also end it at 5. So now we have a little square in here within our grid, and what we call this is the grid area. So this grid area is going to be 37.5 times 3, which I may want to change this actually. So 37.5 times 3 is 112.5. I don't really like that. Let's go with 4 so that we can get an even number of 150. So all we have to do is increase this 5 to a 6, and now it's going to get a little bit larger for us. So looking at this grid area, we can now resize our grid item and it can fit within that space a little bit better. So we know that this grid area is 150 by 150. And if we took our grid item and gave it a width of 100 pixels now, it's not going to change the grid itself because our new dimension is smaller than the grid area that we've defined for the item. Maybe we can also give it a height so that we're working with perfect squares in general here. And as you can see, within this grid, the grid area is defined by this perfect square, but then we've reduced the size of the grid item within it. Now, the next question that we have, the reason that I did this and showed this is because we have to talk about grid item alignment. This might be a little confusing because didn't we already talk about alignment? Like we were moving these grid items around, placing them all over the grid. Is that not alignment? Well, there's actually 2 additional types of alignment we can do with the grid. So the first one that we're about to cover is how are those grid items sitting within their grid areas? Once again, the grid area is going to be defined by these properties right here. And the grid area here is from row 2 to 6 and column 2 to 6 over here. So what we have is some empty space. So this entire I'll try to highlight it on the screen, but we've got a bunch of empty space here around this grid item to fill up the total grid area. And we have a couple properties that will allow us to take that single grid item and move it around within its predefined grid area. What we're going to use to align this is a container level property or properties. So what we're going to be using is justify items, and we'll set that to its default of stretch. And that's going to actually, I believe, no, that does not change it quite yet. And then align items stretch. But if I change these from their defaults and I put in something like, we'll say center. Now this is pretty easy to understand. Center is, we use this with Flexbox a lot. And what you'll see is that it shrinks to fit the content of the grid item. Now before I get any further, you might be wondering, how did I know to put center in here? Well, there's the MDN documentation, and you can always come in and type your properties. So we'll say align items. We'll go to that page, and then it gives you all of the values that you can use. And of course, this particular property can be used on Flexbox and CSS Grid. So if you read further here, it kind of tells you what all of these possible values will do based on what display type you have. So the documentation will explain all of them. I'll try to walk you through some common ones, but just so you can kind of fend for yourself, that's where you would go. So anyways, when we do not have an explicit width or height set, and we put the justify items and align items in there and give it anything but its default. So if we comment these out, it's going to stretch to fit. If we comment them back in and put these to stretch, both of them, it's also going to fit because that's kind of the default value. But if we bring it to center, then it's going to shrink to the size of the content. Now what happens when we bring the width and the height back in? Once we do that, it will respect its width and height, and you can see that we have a 100 by 100 grid item that is centered within its grid area. Now we could also say we want to justify items, so this is going to be the horizontal alignment. We want that to be centered, but maybe we want the vertical alignment, the align items, to be at the end. So we just type end, and that's going to drop down to the base or the bottom of this grid area right here, and it's going to be centered horizontally. Let's make things a little bit interesting here. Right now we have one grid item. If we turn on the grid itself, it's defined by this grid area from 2 to 6, 2 to 6. Let's add another one in. So I'll come here and uncomment our second grid item. It's going to go up to the top left by default. It's going to turn our grid lines off. That's fine for a second. And I'm going to paste down the styles from grid item 1 into grid item 2. For now, I want to uncomment the width and height because I don't know exactly what I want yet. And if I enable the grid again and look here, maybe we want to put this in the bottom right and give it 2 by 2. So that would mean we'll just get creative here and we'll use those negative values. So maybe we want to start at the end and go back 2 spaces. So all we would need to do is say I want to start at the last row, and then I want to start at the last column, and then I want to come back 2 spaces, so that'll be -3. And there's our perfect little square in the bottom right corner. So now we have 2 grid items and 2 grid areas. The first grid item is 100 pixels wide and tall, and it's in the 2 to 6 grid area. The second one, let's go ahead and make the width and height properties, and we'll call them, I don't know, something like 50 pixels. And we know that setting 50 pixels is going to be just fine because we have each item is 37.5, and 37.5 times 2 is going to be 75? Yeah, 75. So in all, we have a 75 by 75 grid area down here. Now, we can go back up to our justify items and align items, and I'm going to, before I uncomment this, I will put this to center. So we should have these grid items centered within their grid areas, and what you should see is that both of them will do the same thing. So I'll uncomment this, and you'll see that they both center within their grid areas. And if I were to put this to end, you'll see that both of them are going to jump down. So what if you wanted to take one of them and center it, and then the other one you want to align in a different way? Well, that is where the justify self and align self properties come in. Rather than setting this on the container level, honestly, most of the times you probably would just do that. But we'll uncomment the justify items and align items, and we'll come down to each property itself, and we'll say justify self, which is going to go right to left alignment, and we'll set that to center. So you'll see this one jumps to the middle, and then align self will also set to center. So now that's going to be centered perfectly. But down here, this one has not moved because we only set that on the first item. So we can come down and copy these styles. Maybe we'll put them both at the end so that it's sitting perfectly in the bottom right corner of our container. So I'll just replace center with end. Do that the same down here, and now we have one that's at the bottom right corner of our grid container. Before I end this video, I'm just going to do a very rapid fire review of pretty much everything that we've covered. I'll try to knock this out in a minute or two. So let's start over. We've got 2 grid items, and the way that we are defining their grid areas is going to be with the grid row start, end, column start, and column end. Let's say that we wanted the grid area for this first one to go from the very top left corner all the way down to row 7 and column 7. Very easy. Just put a 1 as the start value and put a 7 as the end value, and now you've got that huge grid area. Now let's remove the width and the height And you'll see that the content fits because we have justified self as center. But if we remove those, it's going to stretch to fill that whole grid area. Each little grid cell is going to be 37.5 pixels. So if we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells, you would take that and say 6 times 37.5. This is 225 by 225. Let's set the grid item to 200 pixels to make it smaller than its grid. So we'll say width is 200 pixels, height is also 200 pixels. That's going to jump within the grid, but if we wanted to center that and do it at a global level, so let's remove these properties down here. Actually, we'll keep those. We'll set this at a global level with the justify items and align items, and maybe we want to center our grid items within their grid areas. This one is still sticking down here because the justify self and align self, or the grid item level assignments, are going to override that global level assignment at the container level. So that's what we're seeing right here. And backing up even further, how did we get this grid in the first place? Well, we used the grid template rows and grid template columns, and we said that we wanted 8 rows and we wanted 8 columns, each of them to take up 1 fractional unit. If you've got 8 fractional units, you take the total width and height of that container of 300 by 300, divide 300 by 8, that gives you 37.5. 1 fractional unit is 37.5. You want 8 of those, that's your grid. If you somewhat followed along with that quick little summary, then you're in good shape. The next video, we're going to be talking about another form of alignment, which is the grid level alignment. So what happens if our grid itself is smaller than the grid container? How do we align the entire grid? So far, we've looked at scenarios where the grid itself is always the same size as the grid container. But if we were to explicitly set the grid size to be smaller than the grid container, we have 2 more properties that are going to help us align that grid within its container. We should be able to cover this pretty quick, and then we'll get into a challenge. So I'm going to put up this little design on the screen, and your goal is going to be to create this with CSS Grid. But anyways, let's see how we can align grids themselves. So all we have to do to see this in action is come up to our grid definition. So this is our explicit grid definition. And what we've done is we've given an 8x8 grid with equal units within that grid. We still want to have equal units just so we're working with, nice numbers. But what if I change the 1 fractional unit to something smaller? So we know that the total available space within our container is going to be 300 by 300. I explained that in the first video of this series. Give it a width and height of 310 by 310, border 5 pixels, 5 times 2, 2 borders on each side is 10. So our total available space, according to border box sizing, which we have set right here, is going to be 300 pixels. If we have 300 pixels of space in 8 units, 37.5 pixels is how wide and tall each unit's going to be. So if we create each unit to be less than that value, so let's say we wanted each to be 25 pixels, then the whole grid is not going to fill the grid container space of 300 pixels. All we have to do here is come into the 1 fractional unit and change it to 25 pixels. And now we only have 25 pixels 8 times over for a total of, 200 pixels. So that's our height now. And then if we take the columns and also put in 25 pixels, we get the same thing. And as of right now, we have things spilling out of their containers because we have explicit widths and heights on our grid items. So let's comment these out for just a moment. And now you can see that our grid is sitting smaller than the total grid container, which is this outline right here. And if you were to come over to the dev tools and hover over this, you can see, and then we're also going to uncheck the line numbers just so you can see it a little more clearly in this case. The line numbers are going to be great for knowing where your items are going on the grid, but when we're talking about the grid alignment, we don't need them. I'm going to get rid of the other alignment so that we can just focus on this. So we'll get rid of this, justify self. we'll get rid of the justify items and align items, and now everything is going to take up their full grid area within the grid. So the question is, I've got this grid here, it's within our bordered grid container. How do I put it smack dab in the middle? The way that I can do that is a container level set of properties. And what they're called is justify content, and we'll put that as center, and then align content, we'll put that as center as well. After we do that, you'll see this kind of cross-hatched area. This is what we consider to be the implicit grid. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. As you can see though, if I uncheck the grid container, you'll see that the actual grid itself is centered within our grid container. Once again, if you'd like to find out what properties or values are possible here, you can always search that on MDN documentation. So we can say justify content, which we know about a little bit from the Flexbox tutorial. We used it there for aligning content on the main axis. But when we're working with grid, it behaves a little differently, and you can read through these different items to see how it behaves. But generally, the same values apply. Let's now bring this full circle and layer on the justify items, and we'll put that to center, and align items, and we'll put that to center. So what that's doing, it shrunk everything to the content size. Let's bring back some widths and heights. Right now 200 pixels is going to be way too big. Since our grid area is from 1 to 7, that means that there's 6 little grid cells. Each grid cell, as we defined above, is explicitly 25 pixels. So if you did 25 times 6, what is that, 150? Yeah, I believe it's 150. And we can go ahead and set the width and height, not to 200, but maybe to 100 to fit it within. So we'll say 100 pixels, and now it's going to be centered within that grid area. And then we come down here, and maybe we'll set this, since we have 2 little cells, 25 each, that's 50. Let's set this to be equal to maybe like 45 or something. And you can see it's kind of centered within that grid area. I'm going to change the 100 to 120 because it was perfectly fitting there. Now you can really see if this is the grid area that we've defined, it's perfectly centered. At this point, we have the conditions set up to where we can just move things around really quickly and easily. We've got justify content center. Maybe we wanted the whole grid to go to the end, to the far right. We can say end, and that's what's going to happen. Align content center. Maybe we wanted that also to be at the end, so the whole grid goes to the end, the bottom right corner. Now maybe we want justify items to hug the left side of their grid areas. So we'll put in a value of start here, and those will both jump over. And then we'll keep the align item center so that they're vertically kind of centered within their grid area. Say we wanted to override one, so grid item number 2. Let's make this even smaller, like 20 pixels, so we can really see it being centered down there. That's a little small. Maybe we'll do 30. There we go. That's a little clearer to look at. And say that we wanted to take that one item and perfectly center it. Type in justify self, center, and align self, center. And now that one's centered, but this one is hugging the left side and centered vertically. Congratulations, you just made it through the basics of CSS Grid. We have plenty more to talk about, and it's going to start getting really fun here once we start talking about intermediate CSS Grid. But before we get there, I want to finish this video off with a very short little grid challenge. On my screen is the final result that I want you to create, and in the description to this video, I have links to these CodePen documents, and what I've done is provided you with a starter. So this is your starting point, and what I want you to do is turn this into this design right here. So go ahead, pause the video, use your Googling skills, use those cheat sheets that I showed you earlier in the course a couple videos ago, and try to finish this challenge on your own. But before you start, if you've liked this video and this entire course, please subscribe, please like the video. It really helps me out and it's completely free to you. All right, good luck with your challenge. I'll see you in a few minutes. All right, let's get started with the challenge. Here's what we're trying to create. And what it looks like to me is there is, you could of course inspect this with the dev tools and see exactly how I built it, but we're not going to cheat like that. It looks like it's 3 by 3. Looks like everything is relatively equal and we have 3 rows and 3 columns. So that's the basic definition of the grid. Let's go to our starter file and see if we can't create that with what we've got here. So here's the grid container. Style's defined on here, but we can actually, like I did earlier, we can just put everything related to CSS Grid at the very top and it should work fine. So the first thing that we need to do, and this may seem obvious, but you may forget to do it and wonder what's going on. So we'll say display grid. That's going to activate grid in the first place, and it's going to, by default, stretch those items to fill their grid areas and container. I want a 3 by 3 grid with equal quadrants. To do that, I say grid template rows, and I want to repeat 3 times 1 fractional unit, and then I want to copy that down and do the same thing for the columns. Now it's time to open up our dev tools. We'll use this for the rest of the time here. So if we click on grid container and then we show the line numbers, it's a little bit off here. Once again, this is because of that padding. So just bump up your body padding to 7% or something like that. Looks like we might even, okay, there we go. So now these markers are in a better spot. If we go back, we can see how these are all aligned. So the first item looks like it has 2 columns wide, 1 row tall. Let's do that. So all we have to do is select that individual style. We could do it down here. That would be fine, but like I said, we're gonna keep all of the grid related properties up here. So GI-1, grid item 1. So we will put in grid row start of 1 because we want it to start at the top, and then grid row end to be 2 because we just want it 1 tall. It's already that by default, but it's good to kind of explicitly tell it that. Now we'll say grid column start will also be 1 because we want it in the top left corner, and grid column end is going to be 3 because we want it to span to the 3rd line. So number 1 is in a perfect position. Number 2 is in the wrong position. We need to kind of swap these out. So 2 needs to come where 3 is. So we'll come down, grid item number 2. The row start is going to be 2 because we want to start it 1 row down. And then we want it to be 1 row tall, so we'll put the end value to 3. And then I guess it's optional whether you define the columns because it's already taking up that one kind of grid cell. So we'll just leave it off for now. Finally, grid item number 3 is going to take up that entire right column. So we'll say grid row start is going to be 1. Grid row end is going to be 4. And a little trick that you could use that you might often see in other people's code is you can start it at 1 and end it at -1. You'll see that the result is the same because -1 represents the final row line within that container. Since I want this tutorial to be as clear as possible, I'm going to keep it as 4, just so that we really can see what's happening. And then of course we have our grid column start, which is going to be equal to 3, and grid column end is going to be equal to 4. And it was already there, just kind of how things were arranged, the natural flow, but good to explicitly show that. And if we close the dev tools and look at our grid, it looks very similar. It looks like we solved this okay. The last thing that I want to do in this solution is show you a few of those shorthand properties. I've been holding off on showing these. I kind of said we're not going to touch them, but it is cool to see how we can simplify our CSS and do it a little bit more efficiently. To better visualize the shorthand properties of Grid, I created this little mind map. You can find it in the post. Should be in the description, some link down there to this little visual. And if you look at the properties that we have used in our challenge, so this is the one we just did. And you can see that we're using a lot of repetitive things here. So grid row start, row end, column start, and column end. And if we come back to our visual here, so let me get these tabs worked out, you can see that grid row start, row end, and column end is all kind of summarized in the grid area property. So if we wanted to, we could just replace these 4 declarations with one single CSS property, which is grid area. So it goes start, end, end, and it goes from row to column. So remember that, and we'll come down here and we'll say grid area. And so we've already got them lined up. So we're basically just going in order, and we're going to put in 1, 4, 3, 4. And I think you have to separate these by slashes like this. And then if we comment these out, so let's comment all of these out, and we'll put in grid area as the shorthand property. And all you have to do is just go down this line. So row start, row end, column start, and column end. And we'll type the values we had before. So 1, 4, 3, 4. And now we should get this updating. And it's not because I'm not thinking. You have to put little slashes between each of these. And it's not working because I think I have these out of order. I don't have these memorized myself. I probably should. But this is what I just pasted in here is the order of the longhand properties that we need to place in here. So first we need row start, which is a 1. Got that one, okay. Then we need column start, which is 3. So we need to throw a 3 in there. Then we need row end, which is a 4. So let's put in our 4 there. And then the last value that we would need is column end, which is 4. It's already in there. So we can get rid of all that, and now we have a simplified shorthand property that takes care of all of that for us. So let's copy this same thing in here just so that we have it as a guide for each of these additional grid items. And then we can start replacing these with grid area. So row start is 1, column start is 1, row end is 2, column end is 3. We can delete that and nothing should change. And then down here, we can set the grid area and say the row start is 2. The row column start is going to be 3. We didn't define that up there. And then if we want to leave something blank, so we didn't have column start up here, you can just put another slash. And then we want row end, which is 3. And then you don't need that final one either. So that should put it in the right spot. Honestly, it would be probably easier just to define these two if you wanted to, but since we're simplifying, that is fine. And now you can see if we just remove out all these comments that are cluttering up the code, you'll see how simple that is to define the grid area for each of these items. We'll see if we can simplify anything else. So I think the one thing, grid template. So we've defined the template column and template rows. Template area, we'll get to that in the intermediate CSS grid, but for now, let's just replace that and see what we can do. So if we just say grid template, and then we place this value here 2 times and delete this, I think we should get the same exact answer. And we do. So you can actually replace those 2 declarations with this one. So this would be the shorthand way to solve this challenge. It's a relatively simple challenge in general, but hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something from it. This is the first video in what I'm calling kind of the intermediate CSS grid. So not going to be too much harder than what we've covered already earlier in this course, but I am going to get into some things that are not considered, I guess, essential. They're just add-ons that make the CSS Grid system a little bit easier to use. The first thing I want to talk about is grid gutters. So basically the little padding or space between each of the grid items. Now, of course, you could go to each grid item and put some margin on it, which might help a little bit. So let's say that we put some margin of 10 pixels on grid item number 1. You'll see that it does something to space it out, but we get some unexpected behavior. For example, it shrinks, and if you tried to do that on all of the items, it'd get a little bit tedious. There's a much easier way to do this, and it's using the row gap and the column gap property. So if we type in row gap and set it to 10 pixels, that's just an arbitrary amount that I put in there, you'll see that between each row, if I turn on the grid container, you'll see that there's some space there indicated by those hatched areas. If we put column gap in there of 10 pixels, same thing will happen on the columns. You'll have that little space in there, which is really nice if you're creating, say, an image grid or something like that. The next thing that we have not covered yet that we need to talk about is the automatic flow algorithm of CSS Grid. So there is one property, one CSS property that will control the algorithm that CSS Grid uses to place these items within the grid. As you can see, by default, these grid items are going along the row, and then they're breaking to the next line, going along that row, and then breaking, so on and so forth. But just like we talked about with Flexbox, if you remember, we had the concept of a main axis and a cross axis, where we could determine how those items, the flex items, were flowing on that axis. With Grid, of course, we're in a two-dimensional world, so there really isn't a main and a cross axis. There's just horizontal and vertical, but we can define which way those grid items are going to flow. And the way that we do that is through the grid, what is it called? I need to reference something real quick. Let's just pull it up here. So it will be, I think, grid auto flow is the property that we'll be using. And it shows, controls how the auto placement algorithm works. Now there's several values that you can put in here, but the most common are going to be row and column. So if we come back here and we put grid auto flow and set it to row, nothing's going to change. And that is because by default it is set to row, I believe. So if you go to initial value, it's going to be set to row. So nothing changes here. But once I put it to column, things are going to stack vertically and then spill over onto the next column. So you can see how this would be useful. It's kind of like setting the flex direction. If you go back to that Flexbox course that we had earlier, and it tells the items which way to travel in. So I kind of like to think of this similar to the Flexbox flex direction property. So if you remember from that course, we talked about if you set the flex direction to row, everything moves horizontally. If you set it to column, the main axis is vertical and everything flows vertically. So I kind of think of this similar to that, but there's a lot more power to it. And if you go to the cheat sheet that I mentioned at the beginning of this course a couple videos ago, and you come down to the auto flow, I like this visual here because it kind of shows, like, as you add more grid items, which way is it going to go. The one that's a little bit confusing is the dense property. You might look at this visualization and you can't really tell the difference between row and dense. So the dense property, you can read about it on MDN, but it basically is an algorithm that says, okay, if we're spilling grid items over to the next row or whatever, and there's differently sized grid items, and there's some extra space that opens up in the grid based on how everything is flowing, go ahead and try to wrap those additional grid items into that empty little space. This property, of course, can cause a situation where the grid items are no longer in the order that you originally placed them in because they're wrapping up and trying to densely pack themselves into the space available. The next topic, which I think is going to last us until the end of this video, is the difference between an explicit grid and an implicit grid. This sounds intimidating, but it's not. I'll show you exactly how you can derive the difference. So right here we have what we just talked about, and we have 5 grid items. Now in this scenario, the grid is big enough to fit all the items. So if we turn on the grid, you can see there's empty spaces here that we could continue to put these equally sized grid items in. Now if we were to remove this grid autoflow, so let's put it back to the default, which if we don't specify is going to be row. And then what we can do is reduce the number of rows. So instead of having 4 rows equally sized, we're just going to have, let's just say 1 row. So we'll say 1 FR, which is going to define 1 big row. And what you'll see is we've got all of these first 4 taking up that first row, and then our 5th item, because there's only 4 total columns in 1 total row, it has nowhere to go. So what happens here is it actually gets put on what we call the implicit grid. So our explicit grid is what we define with these 2 properties right here: grid template rows and grid template columns. If you don't define them at all, then your whole entire grid is implicit. If you do define them, but then you put more grid items than are allowed within the bounds of that grid you've defined, then it's going to be half explicit and half implicit, or however many items don't fit. So in this case, 1. So the question is, how do we know how big that 5th item is going to be when it spills into the implicit grid? By default, it's going to take the size of its inner content. And in this case, we have defined the 4 columns, so it's going to be as wide as those columns are. But in terms of the rows, since we don't have that extra row, it's going to smush it to be the size of its inner content. So you can see that it's just about the size of that number 5 right there. With the use of 2 additional properties, we have the ability to set a default sizing for anything that falls onto the implicit grid. This can be helpful in some cases because oftentimes you're not going to know how many grid items are going to be within your grid. So you need to define what those defaults are going to be so that all the extra items, if you're loading in dynamic content, you need to be able to respond to that. And you know, if your database loads 1 extra item that was not in the explicit grid, what's going to happen there? You need to have something to respond to with that. So those 2 properties are going to be set on the container level because they apply to all the grid items. And what they're called is grid auto rows. And that's going to be the total, I believe that's the total height that we're defining for each additional row. So if we were to set this to say 75 pixels, I would expect that 5 to get a little bit taller. So it does do that. And then we have grid auto columns, which is not going to apply right now. But let's put it to 30 pixels just because. And the reason it doesn't apply is because we have broken onto the implicit grid from the row perspective, but we're still within our columns here. So if we wanted to see how this works with a grid item breaking outside of both its row and column, we can actually explicitly place a grid item onto the implicit grid. We'll keep grid item number 5 as the one we're working with, and then let me put the line numbers back on our grid. So I did that in the developer tools over here. And we'll come down and define the style for grid item number 5. And we'll say grid row start. We want to start this on row number 2 because there's actually, so we see 1, 2, and 3, but in our formal definition, our explicit grid, we only defined 1 row. So if you put this item between 2 and 3, which technically doesn't exist, it's still going to work. So all you have to do is say 2, and then grid row end is going to be 3. And then likewise, you can see in the columns, we've got 1 through 5 right now, and that's because we set 4 columns, which is going to result in 5 lines or fence posts, as we call them. But just like we can do with the rows, we can start our item at number 5 and extend it to number 6, which doesn't really exist, but once we define that, it will. So we can say grid column start is going to be 5, and grid column end is going to be 6. So what you're looking at now is an item number 5, which is completely on the implicit grid. So at this point, we can really start to see how these two properties that I showed you work. So if we wanted to change the auto height, so anything on the implicit grid is going to have the height we give this. So let's give it 100. That'll make it taller. And then right now we've got this auto column set to 30, which is why that 5th item is so narrow. What we could do is we could say, I want that to be 150 pixels. And now you see the explicit grid is really morphing to fit what we have put on the implicit grid. Now that's a little bit extreme. Let's put these auto dimensions to 50 by 50, which is going to be, I believe, a little bit, well, let's see. We have our explicit grid is defined as 4 columns, and we've got 300 pixels, so that should be 75. So 50 is going to be a little bit smaller than the default item that's put into our explicit grid. Let's add one more HTML element, and we'll call this grid item number 6. And then we can come down and copy this style right here. So grid item number 5, we'll put that as grid item number 6. So instead of 5 and 6, we'll go for 6 and 7, which is going to create yet another piece to this implicit grid. But as you can see, these two items that we've added outside the explicit one they have the same dimensions because we set those as the auto rows and auto columns property right here. But let's say that we have more content in one than the other. So let's put in like a bunch of numbers here for this last one. And you'll see that now our numbers are actually, let's turn our grid back on, our numbers for this one are spilling out of its container. And we obviously wouldn't want that, and this is pretty common that grid items are going to have slightly different sizes in certain scenarios. So a popular way to use these auto rows and columns is rather than setting it explicitly, we can give it a minimum and a maximum value. So there's a function called min-max within CSS, just something that you kind of learn as you're working with grid. And the first argument is going to be the minimum value, and the second one will be the maximum value. So at a minimum, I want these rows to have a certain height. So maybe I'll stick 50 pixels in there as the desired height, but then I'll say I want an auto property for the maximum. So if the content is really tall, it's going to fit that height automatically. And if we put this same thing in for our columns, you'll see that this content that is wider than what's available right now is going to hit that upper bound of the min-max property, and it's going to fit within its grid item. Now obviously you're not going to see a scenario exactly like this. I broke this out really just for demonstration purposes because it's really clear to see which one is the explicit and which is the implicit grid. But more realistically, you're going to have something that looks like one big explicit grid. So let's uncomment this real quick, and then we will remove these styles right here, so those are no longer going to be sitting there. Most likely you're going to see something like this, where you've got the explicit grid up top and then you didn't define, the rows or anything. And quite honestly, you could just delete the grid template rows completely. And what that's going to do is going to pretty much create implicit rows across the whole entire grid container. This is where we could come in, say we have like an image grid and we want 4 columns to be explicit. So we always want 4 columns, but we want the rows to just be automatic. We don't want to have to size them for each row. So what we could come in here and do is just remove that grid grid template rows. So what was sitting up here, we already removed that. And then we'll have our auto rows and columns, or we probably don't even need the columns right now because those will be naturally set. And then let's get rid of this and just set everything to be, say, 100 pixels. And now you can see that the entire grid here, we have an explicit grid going on the column direction, but on the row direction, it's inheriting this grid auto rows of 100 pixels to determine the size of each row as we continue to add content. And if we copied a bunch of these down, you'll see the same thing is happening. We're actually going to spill out of the grid because there's too much content right now. Let me go ahead and just copy something that will fit though. And as you can see, we've got a 300 pixel tall space for our grid. We've added 10 pixels of gutters. So if you count those up, there's one gutter of 10 pixels, another gutter of 10 pixels. So that's 20 pixels. And then you have 100 pixels tall auto rows because we set that property. So if you add this up, you've got 100 plus 10, so 110 plus 100, 210 plus 10 is 220, and then 220 plus another 100 is going to be 320, which is going to break out of that 300 pixel space. But if we wanted to fix that, we could of course come down to our grid container and then just remove that height bound. So once we remove the height, it's going to just fit the grid container perfectly. So there's a lot of flexibility here with CSS Grid, and especially with the explicit and implicit grid. It's an intimidating concept, but once you see, it's really not that bad. In the videos prior, we've covered pretty much everything that's on this screen except for the grid template areas. And that's going to open up a whole different discussion that we're going to cover in this video. Hopefully this one's not going to be quite as long as the rest. We'll see how we get through the content. If you watched the prior videos, you should be pretty comfortable with this layout here. This was kind of the basic CSS Grid challenge that I gave you. And we're going to use this to explain this grid template areas property and also how to name our grid lines. I'll preface this discussion by saying that the grid template areas property and method is not required to use CSS Grid effectively, to use the system in general. But it is a preferred way of many front-end developers, and I wanted to show it to you. I kind of like it, so we'll see what you think. So if we come down to each of the grid items here, we have 3 of them, and just to remind you, we have a 3x3 grid. If we turn that on, you can see what that looks like with all the lines. And if we come down to each of the grid items and we give it this property called grid area, this is going to define the alias that we use to basically tell this grid item where to go on the grid. I'm going to give this alias something very specific, so gi1-alias, just something that we can't mistake for anything else. And then I'm also going to give that to the remaining grid items. So we'll say this one is gi2 alias, then finally gi3 alias. This hasn't done anything yet. We have to add one more property, which is the grid template areas property. And this actually goes on the main container. So these are all the grid items. This is the main container. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take all of these definitions here, so where they start and where they end, and we're going to put it all in one property up on the container. Here's what that looks like. So grid template areas, and then we'll enter to a new line. You can do that in CSS just fine. And we're going to put 3 quotations and then a semicolon. All right, so what I've done here is I've made 3 quotations which are going to represent the rows within our grid. If you notice, we have 3 rows, so we have 3 quotations, and then within this we have space separated values where we place the aliases that we just defined below to define where in the grid we want to place those items corresponding to the aliases. Let's get rid of all of these positionings so that you can see this happen in real time. So the first item needs to go in this grid area between column 1 and 3 and row 1 and 2. So if this is our first row, this first quotation is our first row, then we just need to put gi1-alias in there. And what you'll see, what you should see, oh, that's my bad. It's not going to populate until we have filled it all out. So let me just do that and you'll see what happens. So we want the first one to go in these first 2, and then if I remember correctly, we want item number 2 to be in this little box, and then item number 3 to be on the far right side, taking up the entire height of the column. So in order to do that, we'll pass in gi1 alias for the first two. So you can think of this as we've got the first row right here, and the first two columns are going to be represented by gi1, so grid item 1, and then the last column is going to be grid item 3. And then we come down here and we say this will be gi2 alias. And then there's going to be something weird here, so we're going to put something for an empty space, and all we have to do is put a period. And then follow that up with gi3 alias, because once again, the second row in the third column should still have grid item 3. And then finally, we should have a period for empty space, another empty space in gi3 alias. And boom, all at once, you see how that aligns everything on the grid. And as you can see, here's the empty space. And if we were to space these out a little bit so you can see it better, so let me line all these up. You can start to see that this grid template areas actually looks like the grid, and we've replaced, we've kind of done it visually. So we've taken all of these grid areas from down here and we've placed them in their appropriate spots up here. And this is where the Firefox DevTools come in. You can also click this display area names. If you click this before and nothing happened, it's because we had not defined this. Once you click it now, you can see that we have gi1 alias for these first two, gi3 on that right side, so pretty cool way to visualize what we just did. The last thing I want to show you in this video, it's not something that I use personally. I don't really find a need for it since I generally prefer this grid template areas method. But if we delete the grid template areas method and we delete all these aliases down here, you're going to see the items pop up in their default positions. And what we can do with the grid template rows and columns, we can actually name the rows and column indicators. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, we could call it, start column and end column or something like that. So let's go ahead and do that. All we have to do is extend this out. So the rows, we'll extend it out to 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So that's the same thing as repeat 3, 1FR. And all you have to do is put in brackets, and that will be the name. So whatever precedes it will be the name of the line. So I'll put in our bracket placements here, extend this out a little bit. So instead of, we're looking at rows right here, so instead of this 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's going to be, maybe we want to call it column start, or sorry, not column start, row start, and then this will be row end, something like that. And then this will be just R2, something generic to put in there for now. And then if you were to come down to grid item number 1, and let's say that you wanted to extend the height of it from row start to row end, you can just say this. So you can say grid row start is going to be row dash start, and grid row end is going to be row end. And you'll see that that extends to be within that area. So as you can see, there are many, many ways to dictate how these grid items fit on the grid. You can use the grid template areas, that's my preferred way, or you can explicitly name these lines, or you can just go with the old-fashioned, look at the numbers on the Firefox DevTools. It lays it out nicely for you, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can place your items that way. Now there is one more topic I forgot about, and that is something that's been overarching to this whole course on CSS Grid. And it's the topic of how do we use Grid and Flexbox together. The previous course I did was on Flexbox, so why would I create one on Grid too? Like, aren't these competing frameworks or systems? The answer is no, they work really well together, and you've already seen it happen a couple of times throughout this course. On the screen, I have a few basic rules of thumb on when you should use Grid and when you should use Flexbox. But in general, you'll get an intuitive sense for when to use one or the other. And I'll show you an example here really quick that might help us understand this better. So what I have on the screen here is a basic gallery, photo gallery that I created with CSS Grid and Flexbox. and it kind of demonstrates how we can use them together. You'll really get a sense for it in the next video when we build our holy grail CSS layout. But this is not far from it. We have a header which has some title and then maybe a few nav links or something like that. And then at the bottom we have this small little footer. And then between there we have a scrollable grid of images that I just pulled from pixum.photos, which allows you to get some random pictures on the screen. Now pause the video and see if you can determine on the screen what I'm using Grid for and what I'm using Flexbox for. CSS Grid is great for high-level layouts, and therefore what we're using Grid for is going to be the entire header and then the entire container that we put the pictures in, and then finally the entire footer. So we've got basically what we would call, I guess, 3 rows, and then the columns is going to be 3 columns because we have 3 pictures across. Now the Flexbox piece of this is a little bit more subtle. So these, the text up here and the link up here and then the link down here are using Flexbox to quickly arrange those elements within their containers. So without Flexbox, it would be a little bit difficult. I mean, you could do it with some auto margins, but all we'd have to do here is set the flex direction to row, which is the default, and then put space between for justify content. So I think that's what I had done here. So let's look for the header, or the nav bar is what I'm calling it. And you see that I've said display flex, and then justify content is space between. Now, just to show you what's happening, if we put this to center, those are going to go to the middle here when we reload, and that's not what we would want. So if we undo that and put it to space between, it spaces them out. Likewise, at the bottom with the footer, we're just displaying it as flex and justifying the content and aligning it to center so that it's aligned horizontally and vertically. Over the next hour or two, we'll see how long it takes us, we're going to be attempting to build what you see on my screen here. I don't know the full origin story of how this name came about, but if you go down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia and click the Holy Grail, it says the term is often used to denote an elusive object or goal that is sought after for its great significance. And that describes this layout very well, because before Flexbox and CSS Grid, achieving this layout was very difficult, and there was a lot of CSS hacks that we had to use, including clear fixes and floats and stuff like that, and fixed positioning and absolute positioning. All of that stuff was a thing of the past, but now that we have Flexbox and CSS Grid, this becomes a lot easier. So before we jump in, let's talk about a few of the goals that I have for you in this tutorial. We're going to split this up into a few parts. It'll all be part of the same exact video, but you're not going to have to go through everything if you don't want to. You can kind of skip through things that you're already comfortable with. So the first thing we've got to do is get our coding environment set up. So in this full stack roadmap series, we have briefly used Visual Studio Code, but mostly been working in CodePen, and I want to get you set up with a few extensions and things that will make your life a little bit easier. After that, we're going to set up a basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript boilerplate, and that just means we're going to make our HTML document and then connect up all the pieces so that they are working together. We'll add in a few external style sheets, including some Google fonts and some icons, so Font Awesome is what we're going to be using. And after we do that, we will be all set, and we'll move on to building a mobile-first layout. So this will be the bulk of the video and what I want to mostly concentrate on, and kind of when you leave this video, I want you to be really comfortable with that step number 3. So if you're going to skip anything, do not skip step number 3, where we actually build the layout with CSS Grid. After we're done with that, we're going to actually go through it pretty quickly. So I'm not going to belabor the point. We've already done some examples in prior videos of this full stack roadmap series where we've tediously gone through all the HTML and CSS and gotten into extreme detail. So after we get this layout done, we're going to kind of fly through it using Flexbox and other CSS properties. And finally, we're going to deploy this to GitHub pages so that you can have a shareable link to post on Twitter, wherever you want to share it with. So that'll be relatively straightforward, and we'll get that done in about 5 minutes. I think that's a long enough intro in my typical fashion. I think we're ready to jump in and start building. To get started, you're going to need two things. First, you're going to have to download Visual Studio Code. It's a code editor, and we used it in prior tutorials, so you might already have it. If not, Google it, go to the download page, grab it for the platform that you need or you're working on. The second thing you'll need is a GitHub account. So you're going to be going to this repository. A repository is just a bunch of code files, and this is my account, and I had set up a starter template for us to work with. I'll leave a link in the description for this repository, and don't worry, I'll show you how to get all of this starter code and starter files into Visual Studio Code without having to get on the command line yet to use the Git utility. So let's go ahead and do that. First, we'll open up Visual Studio Code. So I'm on Windows here, and I'll just search for it. I've already got it downloaded. So let's open that guy up. It's going to open on a different screen for me, but there we go. It's just going to open a random file for you, and what you're going to want to do is create a directory or a folder on your computer that you can put all the files in. An easy way to do that is to just clone the repository. So we'll go back to this GitHub repository that I've left, again, in the description, the link for this. And if you go to the code, and you go to HTTPS and click copy on this URL, we can actually drop that into Visual Studio Code. So if you go to the source control utility here within Visual Studio Code, you can click clone repository, and we'll copy in that repository that we just looked at. So we'll press enter. Then it's going to ask us, where do you want to actually save this? For now, I'll go ahead and just save it on my desktop. Fine with me. And what I'll do is create a new folder here, and we'll call it Holy Grail CSS Layout Project. Something like that. Then we'll select that and select that as the repository location. And in the bottom right corner, it says, would you like to open the cloned repository? We'll say open. And now you should have the starter files, and we're working with all the repository, we're all connected up, and we can actually come over to the source control and commit files as we update them to that remote repository that's sitting on GitHub servers. If you want to jump ahead, the Full Stack Roadmap series will eventually cover the Git utility, which is basically just source control. If you want to skip ahead, I'll try to link to a video up here that I walked through the Git basics. And what you would do is open up a terminal within Visual Studio Code, and then you can type in commands like git add all files, git push origin master, and that's going to push those files up, and you got to commit files. All of that stuff is covered in that video. I'm not going to cover it here. For now, we're just going to use the built-in Visual Studio Code source control tool. Feel free to browse through the files. I have a little picture here, a README, and a style guide. That's pretty much it. So there's really no code files. These are just instructions and good reference guides to have open so that we can see some of the colors that we'll be using, right here, and then some of the icons down here. So what we're going to want to do is right-click in the file pane and click New File and type index.html, which is just a standard naming convention for our main HTML document. If you went through a previous challenge within this series, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say emit code snippets. And what that is, it's built into Visual Studio Code, and you can actually type out HTML tags and CSS things, and click tab, and it's going to expand out that code. So if we were to type HTML and then hit the down arrow to go to HTML5 and press tab, it's going to create an entire boilerplate of HTML for us. So we'll go ahead and change the document to Holy Grail Layout Challenge, and that's going to be the name of the tab that we have. And then anything that we put in the body here, so we can type hello world and click save, and now we have a basic HTML document. But the question is, how do we see this in the browser? Well, there's a couple ways to do it, but what we're going to use here is Live Server. This is an extension, so this last little button here in Visual Studio Code, if you go to Live Server I've already got it downloaded, but it's this top one here. And you follow just the basic instructions for downloading and installing it. Then you should have this little button in the bottom right corner of your screen that says Go Live. And when we click this, it's going to open up our Hello World document right here. And it's serving it on 127.0.0.1, which is equivalent to what we call localhost. We'll get a lot more into this later in the series, the Full Stack Roadmap series. You'll just have to trust me here. So it's localhost. If we pressed refresh, we're going to get the same thing because those are equivalent. And then it's being served on port 5500. It might be different for you, I'm not sure. So we can actually copy this link because we're in Google Chrome right here, and I'd prefer to solve this challenge within Firefox. So all you have to do is copy localhost 5500 and open up Firefox or the browser that we're solving it in. And in a new tab, you paste that in, and we have the same thing, same HTML document, updating live. So if I pull this down and make it a little bit smaller, and then let's open this up, go back to our index.html, and just put in some, random text here and click save. You'll see that it immediately updates here in the browser because it's a live server. So that's the basic setup for live server. I think from here, you're going to have two views. So I actually kind of already set this up. I need to close these tabs. And what you'll do is you'll right click, inspect element, and then go up to this little responsive design mode, click that, and then once you've got that, you'll have this bar at the top that allows you to kind of resize the browser. So you can now close out of these developer tools, and in the bottom right corner of the screen, you can now drag and resize this HTML document to kind of simulate different screen sizes. We will also want to inspect the HTML and CSS, but rather than always right-clicking and inspecting element, I'm going to actually open up two tabs. So just like you can have two tabs of Google open at the same time, you can open localhost two times at once. So we'll right-click, inspect element. In this view, we'll just have the sidebar here with our HTML and then CSS down here. So we'll be toggling back and forth between these two, depending on what we need to see. So let me clean this up here. We don't really need this anymore because you've already downloaded it. Don't need this. And we'll use this to kind of reference our design to see what we're building. And once again, this link you can find within the repository files. It's within the README, or you can just copy that link up there in the browser. We've got two more extensions that I want to show you. So the first one is going to be the prettier extension, which is a code formatter. So if you're writing websites in today's age, do not try to format code yourself. This is a much better solution. It's much quicker, and I'll show you exactly what it does here. So right now we have an H2. Let's just make this hello world again. And then if I wanted to tab way over here and make a P tag and put some gibberish in there. But you can see here all the formatting is messed up. So we could come in here and backspace, 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 all of that stuff. But when you're building HTML documents and other documents like JavaScript and CSS, it's kind of tedious to, always be backspacing and stuff like that. So we can install this prettier code formatter. So I just installed it. And now all we have to do, per the instructions, is edit our Visual Studio Code settings. To do that, all you have to do is on Windows, press Control and hit this little caret, or sorry, not the caret, Control P, and I think that on Mac it's going to be Command P, and then from here you type this little forward caret and type Settings, and from here you can go to Preferences, Open Settings, JSON. So we'll click that, it will open a new file, and the two things that you're going to want to look for are these right here. So it says editor.format on save is going to be true, and then editor default formatter is going to be this little string of characters, which if you looked at the instructions for this extension we just downloaded, that's exactly what it tells you to put in there. So it kind of loads it by default. So let's go back to our index.html, and when we click Control S to save this, you'll see that everything moves around. In this p tag that was, way over here and formatted really weird, rather than backspacing, we just save it and it's going to put it in the correct formatting. This will save you a ton of time. I highly recommend downloading that. And if you need to exclude files, you can also do that. I'm not going to get into that right now though. I know I said we had 2 more extensions, but I think I misspoke. That was the last one. I think we're ready to get started. So your editor is all set up. Our HTML document is set up, and I'm going to open up this screen to the left so that you can see things live as we're updating them. All right, so what we're looking at on the right is localhost 5500, which, since we started live server down here in the bottom right, is going to represent this index.html document. So when we change stuff here, if we were to delete this line and click save, you'll see that it updates on the right. Let's get our CSS and JavaScript connected up to this HTML document. So the first thing that we need to do is come up into the head of our HTML document and type link. All right, so we'll go down with our arrow keys to the link CSS and click tab. And what it's going to do is expand out a link tag that references style.css. Let's hit save, and you're not going to see any change because that file does not exist yet. Let's create that on the left by right-clicking, new file, style.css. It will open it up in our editor, and now what we can do is we can target everything. That's just a wildcard, and we'll set it to a color of red. So when we click save, you'll see on the right this turns red, which means that we have our HTML and our CSS linked up correctly. The last thing we have to do is link up our JavaScript. So go back to your index.html. JavaScript always goes at the very end of your body. So we'll go under that H2 and type script. And you want to go down to the script : source, click tab, and now we have to link up a JavaScript or script file. So we're going to just call this script.js. We'll click save here on our HTML. Not going to do anything yet. Let's create that file. Right click, new file, script.js. Click enter. And now we just need to write a basic function to test this to make sure it's working. This is what I like to do. Just make a function. And if you're not familiar with how to write JavaScript, you're going to have to go back in the series to the very beginning where I did several videos in a row teaching you JavaScript and the HTML DOM, document object model, and how to use all of this stuff together. So I'm going to make a test function. And in the test function, I'm going to use this alert function, which is actually window is a global object in the browser, window.alert, and we'll say JS is working. We'll click save. Right now, no way to know how to run this function. But if we come back to index.html and come down under the H2, expand out a basic button, we'll say click me. And then within the button, we're going to add an event listener called onClick. And then what we're going to do is assign the test function and invoke that. So this right here is calling this function if our index.html and JavaScript files are connected up correctly. So we'll click save on that. This button will pop up, and when we click it, you'll see a dialog pop up that says the JS is working just as we wrote within this function. So that tells us that since we have red text and the button works, that means our CSS, JavaScript, and HTML are all working together and we're ready to start the project. Just kidding. Forgot to do one last thing in our setup, and that is add our fonts, our Google fonts, and our icons. This will be relatively simple. And let's open up Firefox to see what we're dealing with. So we're going to be using Font Awesome, which is this icon library, and you can browse all the icons here. There's tons of them. This is a very popular library. And then we will be using Google Fonts, which is going to be kind of the easiest thing to incorporate into our project. So how do we know which ones to grab? Well, if we go to our style guide, open that up, and go down to the fonts and icons section, you'll see that the font that we want is called Dosis or Dosis, and we want all of the following icons. We'll grab these a little bit later. We just need to get it set up in the first place. So if we open up our browser, search for Dosis or Dosis, however you say that, we'll click on that font, and then you get all these different weights. We're going to always grab regular, that's pretty standard, and then we'll also grab bold for 700. All you need to do is grab this link over here, or these multiple links, Control C on that, go back to our files here, and in our index.html document, this will also go at the top. So we'll put it right above our style.css, and we'll say link, go down to C, or actually we don't need to do this, we have it copied. So paste that in, click save, and you'll see that these two links have been added right above our style.css. Adding the icons is going to be a very similar process. You'll just go back to Font Awesome, and you can click start, and they'll ask you for your email. I find that a little tedious, so I just go over here and type in Font Awesome CDN, or Content Delivery Network, and you go to cdnjs.com. This first one right here, which is hosted on Cloudflare, you can just copy the link tag. So we just copied that, and we go back, and right under our Google Fonts, we can click down and paste that link in. Click save, and Prettier is going to kind of format that for us, and we just added this link right here. To make sure that these are working correctly, we can test that out real quick. So let's put our live version of the document. I'll close, actually I'll keep the fonts open for a second. All right, here's what we're looking for. Right now we have some red text and a button, and what you'll see is when we enable the fonts, this hello world text is going to look a little bit different. To do that, let's go to the Google Fonts, and right below it says the CSS rules to specify the families. Let's just copy that, go to styles or style.css, and then we're going to set this on the HTML tag, copy that in, click save, and now when you come back, our fonts are going to look a little different. So again, I'll comment that out, click save. This is the default. Comment it back in, click save, and now it has changed. So our fonts are all hooked up. Last thing is to check the icons. So if we come right below the button, this is where we're going to add an icon. And in order to do that, let's go to Font Awesome, and we'll go to icons, and we'll just pick a random one. Maybe this acorn right here, which happens to be a pro version icon, which we can't use. So let me go to something simpler. We're going to be using the home icon in our project, so we might as well look at that. And you can see at the top, it gives you the HTML that we need. So we can copy this HTML, or I can just show you how to construct it on your own. So we'll use the I tag, click tab, and then to enable the Font Awesome, we just need to give it a couple classes. So the FAS and FA-home are the two classes that we need. And just like this style sheet over here that we are creating ourselves, the Font Awesome library that we just imported up here in this link is a very similar concept. So if we write a class in our style.css, we can obviously use that in our index.html. And in this case, we just imported Font Awesome, and it comes with predefined classes. So we can type in FAS, give it a space because we're going to add another class, FA-home, and let's go back to our document, and we'll click save. And now you can see this little home icon, which is going to be red, is going in there nicely. So we know that everything is connected up. We've got our CSS, our JavaScript, and both of our external libraries, the fonts and the icons. At this point, we can get rid of this ugly red color in our style.css. So that's going to look a little nicer. And then, of course, we can get rid of all of this stuff in here, except for that script at the bottom. Before we start creating the layout, I want to review this 4-step system for writing HTML and CSS. I covered this in a prior challenge video, kind of in our introduction to CSS and HTML, but I want to reiterate this 4-step process because I think it's very helpful as you go to do these things on your own. So step 1, wireframe and mockups. How should this design look and behave on different screen sizes? Luckily for us, or for you, I've already created this and we've got it open here and we can kind of play around, see exactly how it should look. So this is kind of step 1 there. Step 2 is what HTML structure do I need to achieve the design? So this is actually a tricky one and it kind of comes with experience and practice, but it's basically pointing at how do we make the containers and the children items within our HTML to achieve that layout that we're looking at visually. Then step 3 is how do we use CSS to achieve that? And this is where we're going to spend a lot of time in this video and is kind of the point of this entire project, because we're going to use CSS Grid primarily to achieve the layout that you see on this screen right now. And we're going to use it to kind of make it responsive so that it looks good on all devices. And then the final step is adding these styles. So step 4 is kind of the fun part where we start adding colors and fonts and making everything come together how we want it to. So step number 1 is to create the main containers that we need for this. And what I've done in the style guide is link to a picture here. So if you open the preview, you should see the picture show up. It's also here called Layout Starter. It's not very easy to see within Visual Studio Code. So let me open up Figma where I created it. And what we're working with is an outer grid and an inner grid. So if you look at these two designs here, the one on the left is kind of that outer skeleton that you might see if you were looking at this project live. So let's make it that desktop view and scroll to the top, and you'll see that we have that header at the top, the nav bar on the left, and then everything else here in this main section. And that looks very similar to what we're seeing in the outer grid. So what we're going to do is create HTML and CSS to basically replicate this right here, what we're looking at. Once we've done that, then we will kind of say, okay, that part is done. Now let's move to the inner grid. So we're actually putting a CSS grid within a CSS grid. So this main section, this little portion here, is going to represent another grid, which is going to be split into 3 pieces on the widest layout. But enough talk, let's go ahead and start building this, and you'll see exactly what I mean. We'll close let's keep the style guide open, and let me right click and split down. So the style guide will be at the very bottom of our screen, and we can kind of resize that so that we have it available. Here's our index.html. We don't need script.js quite yet. And then style.css, let's split that to the right. Close out the original. So now we have index.html on the left, style.css on the right, and our style guide with all the colors down here. We can click this button to close the navigation and give us some more room. In order to create this layout right here, we'll start with this big version. And what we're going to need is 3 div elements. So the top one, or not div elements, but 3 HTML elements that will be kind of the containers or the parent elements. So we need a header, a nav, and then just a regular div. So let's come into our HTML. And what I'm going to use here are these foldable code tabs or whatever you call them, so that we can focus in on what we're trying to build rather than looking at all this stuff going on up here. So I'm going to collapse with this foldable thing, the head, so now you don't see all that stuff going on. And now when we come down into the body, we can kind of be distraction free. So the first thing we'll do is create a div called outer grid. And I'm using the Emmet snippets, where if you type a dot and then the class name, and press tab, it's going to make a div with that class that you just specified. Within that div, we're going to put those 3 elements. So the header, the nav on the left, and then the main content. So we'll say header, hit tab. We'll make a nav, hit tab. So these are semantic HTML elements. I covered this in a prior video. And then finally, we're going to want our inner grid as a div. So those are going to be the three elements that we're working with. And to start us off, I'm going to add some styles to these so that we can start to see them working on the page. So let's hit save. And if we flip back to our live version of this, you will not see anything going on because we haven't put anything into these containers yet. The first thing I want to do is turn this into a grid container. So in our style.css, we're going to say outer grid to select that element, and we'll set that to a display type of grid. We're also going to want to make this as tall as the viewport, so it's basically as tall as the screen, and we'll set the height as 100 VH, or 100% of the viewport height. Let's give it a background color of blue for a second and click save. And we'll come back to our document, and now you can see that our container is filling up the entire page. You'll also notice that there's a little bit of white space around the kind of corners of this, and that is because we haven't done our basic CSS reset yet. We always want to do that when we're starting our project. So at the very top, and I'm going to start making some sections here so that we stay organized with our code. So here's a comment, and we'll say shared CSS. And then below here, we're going to target all elements with that wildcard character. And we will do our CSS reset, which is going to set the box sizing to border box. We will set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. When we hit save and come back, there's no more white space around this. There's no scroll bar because we have this grid container taking up the entire height of the screen, and it's by default going to span the entire width of the screen as well. I think so that we can see this live, I'm going to bring this code editor to the left. Hopefully we'll still have some room to work with. But I want to see these changes a little bit more real time. So right now we've got this localhost open into responsive mode, but since our screen is so small, I'm going to copy this to another tab just so that we can get full screen. And now what we're looking at is a full screen, just basic blue background with that container. The next thing I want to do is get each of these elements, so the header, the nav, and the inner grid. I want to give those some background color so that we can start to see this. So I will remove the background color on our outer grid because we don't really want to see anything there. But then we will come down to the header, the nav, and the inner grid, and we're going to give those background colors. So background color for the header, we actually have this within our style guide that's in the repository. So we want the outer grid header to be RGBA, so this is a transparent blue background. We'll put that in there, and when we click save, you'll see that popping up. The reason this is taking about 1/3 the height of the screen is because we enabled grid on its parent container. So now this is actually a grid item. By default, that's going to take up 1/3 of the height of its parent. Let's copy background color down to our nav and our inner grid, and then replace those with our style guide. So the outer grid nav bar is going to have the following color. And then the outer grid main area, it's actually the same color, just change the opacity, so we can just change that there. Click save, and now you see our 3 colors popping up on the screen. Using just CSS Grid alone, we're going to take these 3 elements and turn them into what we see here in our Figma document, where we have the header, the nav on the left, and the main content. To keep us organized, I will make another section here. So we have shared CSS, which is going to be everything up there. Now we're going to say CSS Grid styles will be our next section. And we can actually be specific. We'll say CSS outer grid styles because we're going to have 2 grids in total. If we look at our Figma document, kind of that layout that we're trying to achieve here, you can see that in this outer grid, don't worry about anything on the right here yet. On the left here, the outer grid has the header and then, so basically 2 rows. It has the header, which is 1 row, and then the second row is going to be the nav bar and the main content. If you look at it from a column perspective, we obviously have 2 columns. So the header is taking up both of those columns at the top, and then the nav bar is taking up, looks like, or I actually know this off the top of my head, I think we set it to like 90 pixels is how far that's coming out. And then the remainder of the space, the remaining column, is going to be the main container. To achieve that with our CSS, we just have to come to the grid container and we'll say grid template rows is going to be 2 full rows. The first one is going to be, I believe, 70 pixels is how tall we want the header to be. So we'll say 70 pixels is the first row, and then 1 fractional unit is going to be the second one because we want to basically take up the remaining space within the grid container for that main content. The grid template columns should be 90 pixels, so that nav bar coming out on the left, and then 1 fractional unit to represent the rest of it. When we click save, you will see that we're starting to get that layout. So we've got what it looks like that header is up there in the correct spot and then the nav bar on the left, but we still have a problem because we don't quite have our main content. We also have some overlap here in the top left corner. To fix that, we need to place our grid items. So I'm going to use the grid template areas method that we talked about, I believe, in the last video of the grid course. So we need to name each of these child or grid items. I'm going to call this alias header, just so that we're not getting confused with the HTML tag. So that will be alias header, then we'll have alias nav, and then finally the grid area will be alias inner grid. So we'll click save, it's going to format it, and everything's going to disappear because we haven't placed those yet. At this point, let's look at our grid. So there's nothing on the page, as you can see, but if we look at our responsive mode, or actually no, we want to look at this mode right here. So once again, all 3 of these tabs are the same thing. They're all just our document that we're trying to create. They just have different DevTool configurations. So on this configuration, if we open up the body and click on the outer grid, and then we expand this section in the DevTools and click outer grid, you'll see that it gets highlighted on the page here. And then furthermore, you can hover over the grid in the DevTools to see the different sections of that grid. So the first thing we want to do is set the header to equal this top section and this top right section. The way that we do that is type out grid template areas, and since we have 2 total rows, we're going to need 2 quotation marks because each one's going to represent a row, and then within that, since we have 2 columns, we need 2 arguments. We can use these aliases, the grid areas, to specify those. So in the top row, we want the alias header to show up twice to span the entire width of that row. The bottom section, we want the nav on the left and then the inner grid on the right. So we'll type in alias nav and alias inner grid, put our semicolon at the end, and when we click save and come back, you will now see that everything looks great. So we have the header at the top, the nav on the left, and the inner grid in that main portion of the content. And since we said display area names, it's giving us those grid area aliases that we had set. So if you go back to our main layout here without the DevTools, this looks exactly like the Figma document that we just looked at. Now what you'll notice with this outer grid, we're not quite done yet. In the desktop view, it looks great. Tablet view looks great. Now in this mobile view, I've put two of them here, and that's to represent the two different states that we have with our final product. So if we resize this to be a mobile device, we have this little toggle area where we can open up that nav bar and close it by clicking. So we want to capture both of those states within our main layout. We don't want them to be obviously active at the same time, but we'll use JavaScript to toggle that back and forth. So the question is, how do we take this and with just CSS, take this nav bar and kind of hide it to the left? Since we want the ability to toggle back and forth, we can't just come in here and change it like this. So what we could do is we could just say alias inner grid, and now the nav's not going to show up when we click save. Now it's gone, and it's actually down here in the bottom right corner. If we were to make the nav a little bit larger, so we'll give it 50 pixels of height and width. And when we click save, in the bottom right corner of our page, that's where that's sitting, kind of gets knocked off the grid. So when we're in this state where we have a full page layout without that nav bar, we need to not only set the grid template areas to be this, we also need to hide the nav. So what we can do is say display and set that to none. So just like we can display a grid, we can also change the display mode to none, which means kind of make it disappear from the page. When I click save, you'll notice that this little box is going to disappear. And now this layout right here is exactly what we are looking for in that mobile state by default. Only when we click the icon that does not exist yet do we want that nav bar to come out on the mobile view. At this point, I want to stop for just a moment and kind of backtrack and explain something that you might be wondering. So we've been building this layout, and I've shown you the Figma document that I laid out with the outer and the inner grid, but you might be wondering, how did you know to do that? You know, how did you look at this final design right here and figure out that that's what we need? And likewise, how do you, like, I'm about to show you something in order to toggle this navigation, you're also going to wonder the same thing, like, how do you know to do that? The reason that I know how to do this is because, number one, I've already built this. So I've gone through the trial and error process of, okay, this works, that doesn't work, this is a better design, and I've rebuilt it so that it's kind of what makes sense to me in my head. Furthermore, I have a little bit of experience doing it. So I've seen similar layouts, and I kind of remember and recall some of the patterns that we've used or I've used in the past to build those. So I just wanted to kind of break here to give you some confidence that this doesn't come like naturally. You have to build stuff and experiment with things, and sometimes you have to build your layout 2 or 3 times before you get it to the point where you want it. All right, with that said, let me show you how we're going to toggle this back and forth. So let's go to our main layout here. And what we will do is actually add a conditional class. So if you think about with JavaScript in the document object model, we can actually toggle a class on and off from an HTML element with JavaScript. So what we can do is set an outer grid expanded class, and the only thing that that's going to do is take this grid template areas and make that nav bar expand out. So we're going to replace alias inner grid with alias nav. And let's see, before I refresh this, I want to think what I'm doing here. Yeah, so let's hit save. And since this does not exist on any of our HTML, it's not going to affect it. But if we add that class, so outer grid expanded, to that main outer grid HTML element or container, and once we click save, it's going to show up here on the right side. The reason it's white is because we actually are not displaying the nav, so let's comment out these little rules that we just wrote for demonstration. Click save, and now we've got that back. So basically what's happening here, let's open this up, and we'll go back to this view right here. And if I target the HTML, I think there's a way we can toggle the classes on and off. Yeah, so if you come over this .cls and hover, it says toggle classes. So what we're going to want to do is we've already got our outer grid selected. We'll click this .cls and you'll see the two classes that we are working with. So if we take the outer grid expanded off, you'll see that that goes away, and when we click it back, it comes back. So that's the exact behavior that we want when we click that icon at the top that we haven't yet created. But that's just to show you kind of how we're approaching this, the strategy that we're using. So we're going to use JavaScript to do what I'm doing here in the dev tools. I'm just toggling the class on and off. Now, of course, if we come back to our CSS and we go back to the nav element, I'm going to keep the display none off for a second and click save. We'll come back to the browser and you can see we've got 50 pixels for that navigation header. And when I toggle the outer grid expanded off, you'll see that that goes to the bottom right, which is not what we want. We want it to disappear completely. To take care of that, we need another class. So we will come right under our conditional outer grid expanded class and we'll make a hide nav class. And we're just going to set that to display none. And let's see, how do we want to do this? So if we put this onto the nav, so we'll say hide nav will be the default class, then by default we're going to get that totally expanded view, which is what we want on a mobile device. Since we are doing this in a mobile first approach, so what I said we're doing is a mobile first approach to responsive design, which means that all of these styles that we're creating right now should apply to the mobile device, and then later we're going to write some media queries to override those. So the actual correct thing to do here is apply this class by default to the navigation. And by default, we don't want the outer grid expanded class. But just for one more second here, I'm going to save this, save the HTML, and now we'll come back here. So you'll see that the nav is actually disabled, or it's not displaying on the screen. And the reason you're still seeing that is because I have the outer grid expanded showing. So once we toggle that, it's going to be in our mobile view. So this is exactly what we want for the mobile view. And then once we go to the larger view, we're going to display the nav and toggle on the outer grid expanded class. It's really hard to explain this, so let's just do it. And we're going to make this smaller, and we're going to need to open up our script.js file, and I will split this down, close the editor, and now we have our script.js in the bottom left, style.css on the right, and index.html. So by default, we want this outer grid expanded. We don't want that. Don't want that on the outer grid, so let's save that. So here's our default mobile view. This is exactly what we want. We are hiding the navigation, and we are showing an outer grid that has just the header and then the content. So going back to our final design, just to prove that out to you. Here's the final design. If we refresh, this is the default view. So header, main content. In order to toggle something, we need a button to work with. So we will jump a little bit ahead in the tutorial and add that icon. The way that we do that, if we come to Font Awesome, or actually no, we've got this in the style guide. So where's the style guide? It's at the bottom here. I've got this open, and the header menu is going to be this link. So control click. We'll pop that open into another tab. So this is the icon that we want, and we just need to use this HTML. So we can just click it to copy. Within the header, we will paste that and click save. And now our layout's going to have this little button. It's not going to be aligned correctly or the correct color. That's fine. We just need it there so that we can test our JavaScript. On that icon, we want to add an on-click listener. So this enables us to execute a function every time the user clicks it, which is what we want. In our script.js, let's change the name of this function to toggle nav, and let's invoke that function in the on-click listener. So let's save the HTML, save the script, and when we click this button, you'll see a dialog box that says the JS is working. So what we want to have happen when we click this, this is the default state. When we click that, we want to add to this outer grid, the outer grid expanded class, and then we want to remove the hide nav from the navigation element. So two things that we're toggling. Luckily, there is a method that's built into the DOM that allows us to do this very easily. Let's go to MDN for documentation. I'll expand this out a little bit. And you probably would not know where to go. The most reasonable solution would be how to toggle a class. Just type that into Google, but I'll show you exactly where we need to go. So there's something called a class list, which is attached to an element. So if we click on the element, we should get a list of the classes that are on it. Now, if we go way back to our video on the DOM, the way that we get to there is by selecting our elements. So that's step one. In our function, we want to grab the outer grid, and we do that by saying document.querySelector, and we want to select the element that has a class of outer grid. From there, we can then console.log the outer grid.class list. So what this should do is select from the DOM the element with outer grid and then print its class list, which in this case is just one single class. Let's save that. So now we don't have an alert anymore, but if we come up to one that we have open, okay, this works right here. We'll go to the console, and now we will, or actually let's turn off these area names for a second. We'll go to the console and we'll click this button up here. When we click it, you'll see in the right, we have printed something called a DOM token list, which is the, data type that, or the DOM data type that it's going to return from this property. That particular data type, so there's our one class. If you click on DOM token list and you go to the methods right here, we have something called toggle. So what this does, it says the toggle method of the DOM token list removes a given token from the list and returns false. If the token doesn't exist, it's added and the function returns true. So as you might expect, it toggles it. So let's put this by the side here again. And now what we're going to do is say outer grid dot class list. So that's going to return us that DOM token list. And then we invoke the toggle method on there. And then the only argument that we pass to it, if we go to the documentation, it says our first parameter is going to be a token, a DOM string representing the token you want to toggle. And this can be a class or it can be other sorts of tokens. We're using the class in this instance. So the class that we want to toggle when we click this is going to be the outer grid expanded class. So we'll copy that in, put it in there as a string, and now we can get rid of that console log and save our script. And now what's going to happen when we click this is it's going to expand the nav menu. So let's click it. You can see that it expands something out, but there's no nav menu. And that's because we haven't toggled the hide nav class. It's still hiding the navigation. So we have to do the same thing that we did right here with the nav. So let's copy all of this code down. And we'll set a variable equal to nav. We want to select the nav element, so that this line will select it and save it into a variable. Then we can come down here, grab that nav right here, and take the class list and toggle what we call the hide nav class. So we'll save that, and now when we click this, we should see the navigation popping up here, and then when we click it again, it will collapse. The reason it looks so weird as this little box is because over in our CSS, we're still giving the nav an explicit height of 50 by 50. So let's delete all of this stuff. We don't need it anymore. click save, and I believe we should be completed or done with our outer layout. Just to make sure this is working, we'll refresh the page here. So this is our default state on mobile, and when we click this hamburger icon, it's going to toggle out the nav. We click it again, it's going to toggle it back. At this point, our next step is to make this responsive. So we've got a fully functioning navigation, but as you can see, if we refresh it here on this super wide screen, we want to show the nav by default. So if you see in our final view, we're not showing the nav here. As we resize, it shows up, and then as it gets bigger, it kind of just stays there. So this would be a great time to start writing our media queries. So here's the final project, and as you see, it resizes as we resize the device. So the 3 media queries that I've written would be 576, so you can watch this width up here at the top. So 576, the nav bar shows up. At 992, the sidebar shows up. And at 1440, the whole layout kind of shifts to the middle. I talked about this in a previous tutorial in this full stack roadmap series, but the way that I chose those breakpoints is by going to Bootstrap's breakpoints. So these are kind of arbitrary decisions. So I just used kind of a tried and trusted CSS framework. The 1440 I didn't use, but I used the 576 and the 992. So that would be a mobile, a tablet, a desktop, and a large desktop is what we're designing for. To set this up, let's come to our style.css. Let's grab one of these section comments, put these down at the bottom, and say that we want breakpoints. We will start by writing @media, so this is a CSS @ rule. We talked about this in our responsive design video. So @media, and then we set a min width because we're doing this mobile first. So we created all these styles above, which apply to the mobile device, and then conditionally, once we get to these larger sizes, so anything greater than this width that I'm about to set of 576 pixels, we're going to apply the styles within this block. We can copy this down because we know we're going to need 2 more of these. So the next one will be 992 and then 1440. We'll save that, not going to do anything quite yet, but if we jump back to our layout here, the first thing we want to do, this view is fine. Actually, let's look at this one so we can resize it. So this is fine, but once we hit 576, I want that nav bar to show up. An easy way to do that is come into our first media query rule, and we say that we want to target the nav element, and we say display block. Now, by default, this is not going to work because we've actually we've got a more specific CSS rule above. So this would be a case where putting the important keyword is going to be helpful. So we want to override that default behavior. We'll click save. And now as we resize it, you're not going to see anything because just displaying the nav is not going to do anything. I should have known that. We want to grab this outer grid expanded rule, so the grid template areas, and apply that as well. Actually, that's just a CSS rule, so we want to target the outer grid and then paste those in. Once we hit save on this, come back to our design, and as we resize, now you're seeing that nav bar just show up by default. We also want to remove this little icon at the top because once the nav bar is showing by default, we don't want the user to click to try to toggle it on and off, and it doesn't do anything anyway. So to do that, we'll come in the same rule, and we will say that we want the FA bars class, so we can target this icon by using one of its classes, and this will be the unique class that won't apply to any other icon. So we'll say display none. Let's hit save, and now you see that that's gone. So we're on a mobile device. We can toggle our nav back and forth. Let's toggle it off. Now as we resize, the nav shows up and that icon goes away. And as we hit greater breakpoints, that same behavior is going to apply. So setting these rules right here, we can basically cover anything greater than 576, and therefore we don't need these rules in these last two breakpoints. We'll come back to these. We don't have enough content in our document, our HTML document, to even worry about them yet. But at this point, we are fully complete with our outer grid. So this is the kind of the shell container for everything else. In our Figma document, we have pretty much created and completed the outer grid here. Now we need to move to the inner grid. So the inner grid is going to be everything that we put within this div that I've highlighted right here. So we can collapse everything else. We can collapse the header for now. I guess there's really nothing else to collapse without collapsing the inner grid itself. We'll come up to our CSS, grab this label and put it below. In this rule right here, the inner grid, we use this to set a background color and also the grid area, because this is a nice distinction to make. The inner grid is a grid item to the outer grid, but it's going to be a grid container to its direct children. We'll take this CSS rule and copy that down into the, not outer, but inner grid styles. And now what we want to do is come down and say display grid. So we want to turn this grid item into a grid and a grid item. We also need to figure out what goes in this, so what HTML is going to actually sit there. In our Figma document, you can see there are three pieces. We have the main content, we have a sidebar, and we have a footer down here. So if we come back to our HTML, we will first put in a main tag, and I'm actually going to put in something called an article tag. You'll see how this helps just with some simple padding later. So we're going to make a main tag, and then we can actually collapse that. We don't need to worry about that article yet. Then we have the aside element. So the aside will represent the sidebar. And finally, we need a footer element. Let's also come to our CSS and set up some styles for all of these. So we have main, aside, and footer. We'll throw both of these, grid area and background color, onto each of these. And then we'll update them accordingly. So this will be alias main. This will help with our grid template areas once we set those on the parent container. So alias aside, and finally alias footer. If we open up our style guide, which is kind of hanging out at the bottom here, I also have the inner grid colors, the background colors that we need. So the first one, the main content, is going to be this orange color. So we'll replace that there. Then we want a more transparent orange color. And then the final one just ups the transparency a little bit. So we'll copy that in, change that to 0.7, and click save on the style.css and a save on the index.html. Let's flip back to not our Figma document, but our challenge itself. You'll see that it looks a little bit weird. This is going to be fixed as we place these items on the grid. So let's look at it from a grid perspective. So if we select this, we're selecting the footer here, but let's click on the inner grid. And when we unselect the outer grid and select the inner grid, now we can see that by default it's got just a 2x2 grid because we didn't actually define it. We've just got some items in it. So if we flip back to see what we need to create, it looks like in the widest version we need 2 rows, so the top 2 pieces will be row 1 and the footer will be row 2, and then we'll have 2 columns. So if we come back to our CSS, let's go to the inner grid style. This is the grid container, so we set grid template rows, and I said there's 2 of those. Let's look at the amount of space that they take up. So the main content, the first row, should span all of the remaining space that there is left after we give the footer some dimensions. To specify that, all we need to do for the rows is 1 fractional unit, And then we need to put in 60 pixels is how big the height is for the footer. And then for the grid template columns, this one's going to be a little bit different. So if we look at our Figma document in this biggest version, there's going to be 2 columns. And this isn't readily apparent, but I'm going to make this main column, which is going to have the main article in it. We're going to set that to a maximum width of 700 pixels so that the user is not reading an article and has to track, all the way to the right side of the screen on bigger devices. And then this aside will take up the remaining space. So the way that we're going to do that is actually using something called a min-max function. We talked briefly about this in previous videos on this grid tutorial, but basically we can give it 2 arguments, the minimum width that we want and the maximum. So minimum is going to be the content width. We'll just set it to auto. Maximum, like I said, is going to be 700 pixels. And then the next argument is going to be the second column. So what we just defined was the dimensions of that first column. Then the second column is going to be 1 fractional unit, which is the remaining space. You can now see that our inner grid that we have checked here, so we can check both actually, and now we have the outer and the inner, but uncheck the outer, and now you can see that we've got the main content here, and then the aside over here, and then the 2 little footer areas. But at the moment, we don't have these elements laid out. So let's go back to our CSS and type out the grid template areas. Since we have 2 rows, we need 2 of these little quotations. So that's the structure, and we have 2 columns, so we need 2 arguments for each. So the first one is going to be the alias main. The second one is alias aside. So that for that first row that spans the entire remaining height, we have the main and the aside, and then we have the alias footer spanning across the entire bottom row. Let's hit save. We'll come back, keep flipping to the wrong one. And now you can see I've got the area names selected in the inner grid, and you can see that the alias main is sitting here, the aside is over here, and the footer is at the bottom. So ultimately, let's look at the this version. Oh, I've made a big mistake down here. So this is invalid CSS. We need to add RGBA at the beginning. That's why we were experiencing an error. That should fix things a little bit. All right, so now it's looking better. So we have this outer grid area that we created earlier. Now we have the inner grid area, which is actually a subgrid of one of the outer grid items. This looks great, but we do have one problem. As we resize this, go to our mobile device, it's not exactly doing what we want. So it looks like the aside element is just completely disappearing on a mobile device. That is because what we just did was a version of desktop first design. We need to do a mobile first design. So if we come back to Figma, what we really should be trying to figure out is how do we create this little layout down in the bottom right. So we'll open up our CSS, and since this is the desktop version, we'll take all of these definitions right here and copy them, and then we want those to apply starting at this breakpoint here. So we'll paste those in here, and then of course these need to be part of a selector. So let's paste those in there, get rid of this, and click Save. So now it will apply on anything greater than 992. And we can come up to the top, and on our mobile device, which is the default, mobile first, we need to change this up a little. So the rows are actually going to be 3 total rows. So we look at our design here, we have a section here, down here, and at the bottom. We know that the footer is going to be 60 pixels, so we can keep that. We know that the main content, the first one, is going to take the remaining space. And then in the middle, this will be a sidebar. We want that to be the size of its content. So to do that, we can just put in auto. So now we have the top row is going to take up remaining space. The middle row, or the second row, is going to be the size of that sidebar. And then the final row is going to be the footer, which is 60 pixels. Now, I'll have you notice that we have not put anything in the sidebar. So since it's set to auto, it's going to collapse to be pretty much 0 height. So when we click save on this, that's what's going to happen. Furthermore, the columns is only going to be 1. So we just get rid of that min-max. The columns is just going to be 1 column, and it's going to take up all of the space. Finally, for the grid template areas, we just want the alias main to be the first row. We need to copy one down because we have 3 rows, and then we'll replace these 2 with a side, and then the final one will be footer. So these are going to be the mobile styles. Let's hit save. Go back to our layout, and you can see that it has worked. And as I mentioned, the sidebar has no dimensions, so it's kind of collapsed here between the top and the bottom one. If we came back to our CSS, went to our aside element and gave it a height of 100 pixels and hit save, then when we come back, you can see that it has popped up right here, and we're looking a lot closer to this, or actually exactly like this layout. And since we already gave it those media query styles, so once we get above 992, we're going to change that grid layout to be what we created in the first place. So now we can resize things, and you'll see how that changes. Right there, we got it to size over there, and you see this blue space. That's because this sidebar, we told it to, we gave it 100 pixels, so it's not expanding to fit that entire grid area. So if we come back to here and get rid of that height, hit save and come back, now it's going to take up the entire height. And that's it. We are done with the layout section, and I'm pretty happy with what we've created. This is a robust layout. We know that it's going to be intact when we start adding content, and it's really smart to go through and create this the first time around, and then you start adding content once you're confident that the layout is going to work how you intend. So just to review, we've got it at the mobile size, full content, got a footer down here, a header. We hit this button, it toggles out the nav bar, which goes to the bottom. Then we hit it again and it collapses. Now the last thing we need to do before we're completely finished with the layout is handle a case where this main content is taller than the visible screen. And that's a very real possibility. If you're dealing with this layout, you probably have blog posts, and a blog post does not fit on one screen. You always have to scroll down through it. So if we go to our CSS and we give the main content a height of 2000 pixels, that's very reasonable. We'll hit save, come back, and now you see there's this little scroll bar on the right. Let's get out of our responsive mode for a second. You see here's our scroll bar, and we're scrolling down, but what's happening is everything is scrolling down at the same time. We want to actually leave this header up at the top as we're scrolling down so that the header and then the nav bar are kind of just sticky there, and they just sit as that outer template. This is actually a lot easier to fix than you might think. All we have to do is take this, this inner content, the main content, and set an overflow property on it. So to do that, we'll come to the inner grid, and we'll just set this at the very top. So we'll say overflow is going to be set to scroll. Once we hit save on that, we come back, and now as we scroll, you'll see that we're scrolling up and down here, but the outer template is staying in place, and that's exactly what we want. You'll also notice there's a scroll bar on the horizontal direction. We don't want that, so to fix it, all we have to do is take this overflow property and say -y. So this is a completely different CSS property that only sets the overflow in the vertical direction. Hit save on that, go back to our layout. Now that bottom scroll bar left and right is gone, and I'm pretty happy with this layout at this point. So we're done. We are completely done with the layout, and if we go back to our video outline, we have gotten our environment set up, got our boilerplate, and we built a mobile-first responsive layout with the JavaScript toggle functionality. All three of these steps took us, I think, well over an hour. Not exactly sure the recording time at this point, but that's honestly the hardest part in most CSS and HTML layouts. The next thing that I'm going to do, and what I always do, is kind of go component by component, feature by feature, and get the HTML content that I need in there and get it aligned in the correct way. After doing that, then I'll go in and add colors and font styles and all that kind of good stuff. I think a good place to start is going to be our header. So the top bar up here, we're going to start with that, and let me collapse this down so we can see it side by side with our code. If we're looking at our HTML, this is what we're creating, the header right now. So let's use these Visual Studio Code foldable accordions to get rid of the grid, the inner grid, so we don't have to look at that, and then we'll expand out the header. Currently we just have a icon in it, and it's not showing because we're not on a mobile device, but once we hit that mobile device, there's the icon. So we'll just work on it from this view to start. So here is our final one, and let me shrink this so we can see it in the mobile view. We have 4 total elements up in this header. So we got the icon, kind of a mock logo. I just put some text in there, and then we have these little groups where we have an icon on top and a link on the bottom. Looking at this from a high level, what I see is 2 groups of items. So we've got a left side of the header and a right side of the header, and those have space between them. So there's kind of just space pushing those to the edges, and if you know how to use Flexbox, which you should if you've watched the prior videos in this series, you know that there's a property called justify content, which has a space between value that we can do exactly that with. So in light of that, let me create those containers. So we'll come within the header, and I want to give a class to left header, so that'll be one div, and then we'll come right below that and say that we want a right header. So there's our left portion and right portion. This icon is going to go into the left header, so we'll cut that and put it up here. Then we have the logo, which is just an H2 element. We'll type that out as logo. Also should give that a class of logo so that we can style it later. And then the right side of the header has got those little groups. So if you want to stack an icon on top of text and align those, you're probably going to need a little flex container. So what we're going to call this is a header link. So we'll give it a div with the class of header link, and then within that div, we're going to give it some sort of icon and then some sort of link. So we'll put an A tag in there. Just give it an empty link for now, and we'll name it video and then article. So let's take this entire group, paste that down, and change this to article. Okay, so we should have all the elements here, and what we're going to do while we're still looking at this is we're going to take, let me collapse this so that you can see it. We'll take the right header and the left header, and we will align those with Flexbox. So we'll turn the header parent into a flex container, and then the left header and the right header, sorry about that, will be the flex items that we'll space out. And then as we drill into this, on the right header, we're going to open this up, and then each of these divs, so the header link, both of these are going to be flex containers with a flex direction of columns so that the icon goes on top of the link, and then we can align those along a vertical axis. So let's go back to our design. It still looks like nothing because we haven't saved, so we'll hit save on that HTML. And now you'll see the icon, logo, video, and I think the article might be overflowing vertically. So we'll come back to our styles and go find the header styles. I don't think I have a section for that yet, so we'll come down here right before the breakpoints and make a comment that says header styles. And then we want to set the header. As I said, we want to set that to a flex container. So we'll say display flex. And what that's going to do when we hit save is make everything go horizontal. So our left header is that icon in the logo, and then our right header are those two links. And then, like I said, we want to say justify content space between. And when we hit save, those are going to get blown out to the edges. So we'll hit save, and now you see that our left container is at the very far left side and our right containers at the very far right. Now these are obviously not centered within the header. An easy way to fix that is say align items, center. So now we've got those centered. And as you can see, they're hugging the left side and the right side of that container. So we might add some padding. So we can say padding. Padding is going to be, I think we'll say 20 pixels and 0, something like that. And I think I got that wrong. So the first argument is going to be the top and bottom padding. So we want that set to 0, and then we want the left and right padding to be set to 20 pixels. So now that we've done that, we've got this little space over on the left and on the right. So let's work on these individually. So we'll start with the left header. So let's target that with a CSS rule. And to get that logo and the icon to be on the same axis, we need to display flex. So create that as a flex container. Now they're not vertically aligned, so just like we did with the overall header, we're going to align the items to be center. So now those are centered, and as you can see, they're kind of smushed together. So we might just add some margin to the right of the icon or maybe to the left of the logo. If we add the margin to the left of the logo, then when the icon disappears, it's going to kind of look weird. So I think what we should do is put margin to the right of that icon. And then when the icon disappears, the logo will just wrap to the left side where this icon is. So let me show you what I was talking about here. So in this view, we have the icon. As we resize it, the icon's going to go away. So let's set some margin left on the logo, which is kind of the incorrect way to do it. So we'll say logo margin left, and I'll give it something ridiculous. So 80 pixels so that we can really see what's happening. So once we set that, the logo gets pushed off the icon, but see what happens when we resize and the icon goes away. The icon goes away, but we still have that margin left, so it's pushing it out. So instead of doing that, let's set the margin on the icon itself. So if we open up the left header, we have an icon that we can target with the FA bars class. So we'll do that right here. We'll target FA bars, and we'll set a margin right of 80 pixels and get rid of this logo margin. And I think we might even be able to get rid of that whole class. So let's hit save. And now you can see that the icon right here is pushing the logo out with its margin, but then as we resize, this logo is going to come and sit snugly against the left side of the container, which is exactly what we want. So let's put it back to mobile size and then set this to something more reasonable. We'll try something like 10 pixels. I think that looks pretty good. And then as we resize, it's going to go to the left, which looks pretty good to me. Now let's move on to the right side of the header. So we need to target that class by saying right header. Let's open that up. And within it, we have two header links. We need to obviously make those not stack on top of each other like normal block elements. We need to make them side by side. So that's, once again, a display flex. Turn that into a flex container. Now they're next to each other. And then, of course, we're going to want to add some margin between them because right now they're just smushed together. So why don't we come down to the header link classes, which are each of those containers, and put some styles on that. So we'll say maybe margin left is going to be 10 pixels. Now watch these, they'll spread out when I save. That looks pretty good. You'll notice there's no icons here, and that's because if we go into each of these header link classes, we just set an empty I tag. We didn't give it a class, so it's not going to show us an icon. Let's put a class in here. This will be the same, navigation icon, but just to show what's going on, we'll click Save. And now you see that navigation icon sitting next to its link right here. We want those to be sitting on top of each other. So in order to do that, we need to make the header link container a flex container. And then we need to set the flex direction there to a column. So let's hit Save. And now you'll see the icon goes on top of the link. Let's go ahead and get the same icon down here in the other one. So you see both of those are working. Now we just need to kind of vertically align those two. The way that we do that, because we've set a flex direction of column, we want to align these items on the cross axis, not the main axis. So all we have to do there is say align items center, and those are going to line up. The last thing we need to do is just change these icons to be the correct ones. So down here at the bottom, I've got my style guide, and it's got all the icons you need. So we need the video icon and the paragraph icon. So I will go ahead and take that link, open up a new tab, and here's the video one. So we'll copy that HTML, and we will replace this icon here. Now we need the paragraph, so I'll get this link. We'll visit that in the browser. Here's our paragraph icon. We'll get the HTML, replace that one. We're done there, so we can come back, and when we hit Save, we should have the correct icon sitting up here. Now, as you can see on the final design, these icons are a little bit smaller. So we can set that with a font size property. So if we go to the header link, we can target any I tag within the header link will have a font size of, we'll say 0.8 rem units. So root element, that's going to be the HTML. And speaking of, we should actually go to the top with our shared CSS. We've already set the font family, but we should set the font size to our main HTML of 16 pixels. That's just a very standard font size. And I think it's actually the browser default, so this doesn't really matter, but we'll be explicit about it, and we'll set on the root element, which is this HTML, 16 pixels. So that means when we come down here to our header link font size, we're saying I want to take 80% of 16 pixels, or 0.8 of the root element unit. So when we hit Save, those icons are going to get smaller. So that looks nice, and notice the icon over here next to the logo did not get smaller because we're targeting the icon that is a descendant of the header link div or class. All right, it is now time to actually make this look good. Right now we've got everything in the right spot. We don't have the right colors or anything like that. So looking at our style guide, if we expand this out, it will show you that the colors, the header and the footer background color is going to be this one. So if we go back, it's going to be this like dark green. So that'll be the first thing that we set, and we might as well set it down here on the footer as well. So let's come up to, or let's copy this color. So there's our background color. And we'll go up to the top, and we'll put in the shared CSS, header and footer are both getting a background color of that. Let's hit Save. And it didn't work. It didn't work because we came to the top of our style sheet, and for the layout purposes, so that we could kind of visualize, if you remember, we came down here and we said the header is going to have a background color of that blue. So we just have to delete that, because if we set something at the top, it's going to get overwritten, cascading style sheets. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the series. So let's hit Save. Now we're getting the right colors, but obviously all the text is the wrong color. So But one more thing while we're up in the shared styles. So in the shared CSS, we also want to set the text color. So for the entire document, we want to make the text color the same as this background color, except for the header and the footer, obviously. So what we can do here, there's a couple ways we could do this, but let's take this text color, which is the same here. We'll copy that, and then in the HTML, let's set the color equal to that. Now when we press save, we're going to have problems because now we've set the color of every text. The links doesn't apply to the links, but same as that background color. Now we could solve this a couple ways, but an easy way, since this declaration is directly above this one, we can just come override that within the header and footer. So we want the color for the header and footer text to be, I believe, the same as the link text color. So let's copy that, set it here, and click save. And now you'll see that those text colors are working and standing out off the background. Now, of course, our links up here are the wrong color, but we want all of the links throughout the entire document to be this same kind of light green. So we can do that in the shared styles as well. So we can come up at the top, set all the A tags to have that same color, click save, and now we have the correct link colors. There's one more thing up here in the header that is not apparent that we need to do, but we definitely need to do it. And that is what happens when we hover over this icon. You can see nothing happens, but when we click it, it actually does something. So for a user experience perspective, we need to indicate to the user that when you hover over this, you can click on it and it'll do something. So the two things that you can generally put on this from a CSS perspective is a cursor type and an opacity. Let's come down to our header styles, and with the FA bars, that represents this icon, we can set a hover state. So FA-bars, and then give it a pseudo class of hover. Now we want to change the cursor to be a pointer, and we want to set the opacity to be 0.8 or 80% opacity. So let's hit save, and now you can see when we hover over this, our cursor changes and the color gets a little bit lighter. So it kind of indicates to the user, hey, you can click me and something is going to happen. Okay, so I'm going to expand the screen for just a moment and show you what it looks like on a huge desktop. So my screen is, I think, well over 1440 pixels or bigger than that. And you can see that when it's such a big screen, the logo's all the way over here on the left and the links are all the way over on the right. And if you were to look at a lot of layouts, so if you go to Twitter or something, you'll see that on a desktop device, they kind of bring everything to the middle so that the user doesn't have to look way over here and way over here to see the relevant items. So that will be our final breakpoint. And the way that we're going to solve this is, truthfully, I don't think it's like the greatest way in the world, but I kind of put this on at the end, didn't have a lot of time to perfect it. So as we resize this screen, you'll see that once we get into this larger territory, it starts to look weird up here. So at 1440, we're going to bring everything into the middle. So we need to add some space off the left side of this logo and the right side of this little grouping here. So we can actually use CSS Grid to do this for us. So what I'm thinking we do is basically split the header up into 3 columns, and the middle column we can kind of resize to feel it out and see where we want it. We'll definitely have to come back to this once we get all of this content in here just to see how it all lines up, but we can set the outline here right now. So let's kind of collapse some things so that we see what's going on, and the grid container that we're going to want is header, but we only want it on this largest style. So anything greater than 1440, we'll come into header and say display grid, and you'll notice I'm already greater than 1440. Let me actually switch over to this view so we can resize. So once I hit save, you'll see that on this screen, now we've got these items all jumbled up because that we haven't actually placed them on the grid or defined the grid itself. So the grid that we want is going to be one row. So because it's going to be one row, we don't really need to define the grid template rows property. So we'll just start with columns, and we're going to say one fractional unit. We'll say 1,000 pixels, or I think what I did was 950 on the final design, and then one fractional unit. Let's go ahead and hit save on this, and you can see that things are spaced out a little better. If we go to this other view where we can actually look at the grid, you'll see exactly what's going on. Let me bring these tools down at the bottom so we can see a wider screen. So here's our grids. Right now we're looking at the inner grid. Let's uncheck that and check the header. And you can see this is the grid that we have created. So the middle is 1,000, and then the two edges are the remaining space. So what I'm thinking is that since each of these groupings, so the header left and the header right, since those are going to be kind of at the edges, I'm going to take the header left, and I'm going to push it against the right edge of this left little section here of the grid. So it's going to sit, at the very right edge, and then this other one is going to sit at the very left edge of the very, right side of the grid. The way that we can do that is with the align self properties, or justify self. So we need to first take our left header and our right header and give them a grid area. So we'll call this alias RH for right header, and this will be alias LH for left header. Now we will place these items, so grid template areas, and since we have one row, we just need one quotation here, and we're going to put the left header in the left portion. We're going to put a period in there because we want a blank space in our grid, kind of in that middle section, and then and I'm sorry, I just said left header. It needs to be alias LH, then the period, and then alias RH. When we hit save, you'll see that we get alias LH, alias RH, and then the left header and the right header sitting in those. Now the only thing that we have to do is take the content itself and place it within its grid area. And we know from our previous lessons we can do that with the justify self property. So we're going to do end for the left header because we want it to go to the very end of that container. And then justify self on the right header is going to be start, which it already is that, but we'll just define it explicitly. So we'll hit save, and now come back, and you see that the logo is sitting here at the right edge, and these are sitting at the left edge. And at this point, there's just one more thing we have to do. I was waiting until we got the header done to do this, but we've got the logo over here and these items here, but our nav bar is still way on the left. We've got all this space here. We want to bring it all to the middle. So what we'll do to get there is in this media query, we'll come to the top and we'll specify for the outer grid, we want a few different definitions for our grid. So for grid template columns, we're going to want the same thing as we had here. So one fractional unit, 950 pixels, one fractional unit. And then we can leave the template rows the same, that's fine. We just need to, so whatever is above this on the other views is what we're going to inherit. And then we're just going to update the template areas. So now we're going to have, let's see, we should have 2 rows. And now we're going to put alias header, alias header, alias header. And then we want alias nav, alias inner grid, and then we'll say that one more time here. So let's hit save, and now you can see that everything is kind of brought in. Now this doesn't really make sense at the moment, but you'll see how this actually will work out once we get the remaining elements into this layout. All right, so let's redock on the right. We can go back to our other layouts. I think we're done pretty much with the header. So let's resize this to our mobile. So our header's done. Now we have to move on to that nav bar, which if we expand it is just empty. So let's go to a size where we can, or let's put this down here, and we'll go to this size where that nav bar is going to show up naturally. Okay, so if we look at our final design here, let's collapse this a bit. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So here is our kind of tablet and above design. So our mobile obviously doesn't show the header until we toggle it, but it's going to be the same thing once we toggle it. So here's what we want to try to create. You can see the background color is none, it's just white. And then we have these three little groups. So very similar to what we did over here with these header items, we want to do here in the nav. So let's come to our HTML. We can go ahead and collapse the header for a second and open up this nav. And since we have those three groups, let's actually open the header back up once more and copy this div that we had created for the header link. So we're just going to copy this as a place to start, and we'll paste that in, and we'll call this a nav link. We need a new section in our CSS, so header styles, come down under that and say nav styles. Then we're going to want to take the styles from that header link, copy those down, and call it nav link because that's what we're calling this new container. We probably don't need the margin left because they're going to be stacked vertically, so we'll delete that. And let's save this CSS and save the index.html. And when we come back, you'll see that we have a start to what we are trying to create here. The first thing I want to do, like, we didn't do this with the header, but I want to remove this background because it's just so ugly. So let's come up to where we did that in the nav, just delete that and hit save. So now we're working with something a little better. And as you'll see in the final, these are going to have slightly different colors. So we want everything to be the main text color, and when you hover over it, it basically gets less opacity. Right now, when we hover over this, we get some unexpected behavior. So we can come down to the bottom here, into our nav link. So anything within the nav link on the hover state, we want to make the cursor a pointer, and we want the opacity to be 0.8. We also want all of the colors here to be that main text color. So if we come up to the top, grab that color that we used for the text, and put that in there. Now we refresh, and you'll see that it's not targeting the A. Oh, that's because we want to set this on a non-hover. So the color needs to come up here in this style. And then we also need to separately target the links in here. So maybe a better way to do this is just say navlink, comma, navlink links. So right now you'll see that when we hover over it, it kind of gets less opacity and we get the little pointer icon, so that's good. We just need to remove this underline and change this link color to be the same as the icon. To do that, we'll just come down and say any link descendant of this container is going to have a color of 1E4040, which is the main text color. So we'll hit save, and now they're the same color and we're getting the result that we want. We just have to remove that underline. So what we'll do is we'll say text decoration will be none on the A tag. And when we hit save, it updates and it looks very similar to what we're dealing with here. So at this point, we're ready to kind of duplicate this down. So we've got the nav link, we can just copy this 3 times over, hit save. Now we've got 3 of these, and now we just have to edit the icons and the text itself. So we need home, profile, and billing. So we'll update that real quick. So now we've got the right text in there. Now we just need to update the icons themselves. So I'm just gonna, rather than trying to go down in the style guide, you can go there if you want, and it has all the links to these. I'm just gonna type them in because I already know them. So the first one we're gonna need is FAS, FA-home. Then we're going to need FA user circle. And then finally FAS, FA $sign. Let's hit save. Now you can see all the icons are updating. And then finally what we have to do is obviously space these out a little bit and push them down from, hugging this header element. A great way we can do this is just putting a margin top on each of the items. So if we just go to navlink and say margin top is maybe 20 pixels, that's going to spread them out. It pushes them off this header and kind of off each other. It's not going to be exactly the same. It's pretty close though. So we could definitely put some more spacing at the top of this, but I'm okay with this for now. Or actually, let's just take care of it. So we'll target the nav container itself, and we don't want to put margin on that because if we put, say, a margin top of 20 pixels there, it's going to, well, you can't see it, but if we give it a background color of blue, you'll see that the nav has actually pushed off of that header. So we definitely don't want that, but if we change this to padding top of 20 pixels, that solves it, and it pushes these items down a little bit further, and it looks great. So the spacing's a little big here, so we'll change this to 15 pixels, and now we're looking really good here with that nav bar. And as you can see, when we resize this, the nav bar is going to disappear, but we can open it up, and then we can click on some of the links here. So really convenient way to do this, and it looks great so far. Now that we have this nav built, I'll open this up and show you on that huge desktop device. Here's what's happening. So the nav items over here are kind of going to the middle. We definitely want to push those to the very far right side of their container so that they sit right here. And then the content, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So in order to solve this, I think we're gonna have to just throw a flex container on it. So if we come down to our largest style, which that's the only one it's a problem on, we can take the nav container and turn it into a flex container. But they're not working because we have another style competing with this. So if we search, let's go ahead and Control F this window and search for our nav styles. And you'll see that we have a few here. And right in this media query, we are saying display block important. And what that's doing is, on anything greater than a mobile device, we want to display the nav, by default. We don't want to have to toggle it. But this style, since we set it to important, is actually overriding this style down here. So since we're going top to bottom, it's okay. We will put an important at the end of this one, and that will override the one above. So that, when we click save, now they're going to be flex containers, and then we just have to say flex direction will be column. Now they're sitting on top of each other, and now we can just push all the content to the right. So we'll say align items flex end. And now they're going up against that right edge. Now we, of course, need to kind of push those off a little bit. So we can set the nav link classes to have a margin left of maybe 15 pixels. So what we can do is set some padding to the right of maybe 15 pixels. And those will jump off and kind of have some spacing there. So now we're looking a little bit better. Those nav items are not way on the left on this large layout. And then of course, what we just did does not affect anything smaller at all. So we're good there. All right, we are ready to make this main content here. So we've got the main article, then we have the sidebar, which wraps down on this smaller screen, and then of course the footer itself. So what I'm going to do is actually leave you, so when you download this repository, these two files that I'm creating now will come by default. So we'll say article content or sample article content.html, and then we'll also have sample sidebar content.html. And what I'm going to do is paste into the article content a bunch of HTML that you can use, as well as the sidebar. Now for what you're going to do is you'll come into each of these. So we'll get the sidebar content here, copy this, put it down in this aside element, and save it, and it'll get formatted. And then let's see, what's the other one? Would be the article content. We will copy that and paste it within the article tag. Click save, and now you'll see that we have a bunch of content in here that we have to do something with. The first thing you're going to see as you scroll down is there's a bunch of overlapping text, and that is because at some point in this tutorial, I believe I set a height on the main element. We do not want that. We want it to fit its content, so let's hit save. Now everything's spaced out pretty well. We've got our main section, our sidebar, and our footer down here. What I'm going to do so we can still distinguish between these is keep the sidebar background for now, and then we'll remove this main content background because that's a little bit annoying. So let's remove that. Now it's getting a different color because of our previous one. So let's come up a little bit further. Where did we do this? Okay, so the inner grid, we don't want that. Okay, so now we have white background here, which is great. The first thing I'm going to do is put some padding in here. Now, this is the reason, and let me clean up my HTML so you can really see this. So we've got the header collapsed. We can collapse the nav. Let's go ahead and collapse the entire article, and then we'll collapse the aside. So now you can see the outer structure, and you see how I wrapped the article within the main. So now I can just come down into main, the main style, and I can give it padding. So I want to give it a determinate amount of padding on the top and bottom, and then I want the padding to be a percentage of the screen width as it goes left and right. So let's see, what did I set this to? We'll just play around with it. So the first argument, I believe, is the top and bottom. The second one is going to be the left and right. So let's hit save. And you'll see that it kind of came in a little bit. Now it's tough to see with this nav bar, so let's collapse it to the mobile view. And now you can see there's this little gutter on the left. So if we we comment that out, it all kind of wraps like this, and then when we bring it back, now as we resize, the left and the right padding is going to kind of be responsive to the screen size, and then the padding on top and at the bottom is going to be 20 pixels. You are also going to notice that all of this text is just bunched together. And that's because we need to set some margins on the top and bottom of each of our H2, H3, and paragraph elements. So let's go ahead and do that in our shared styles. We'll come to the top where we have our shared CSS, and let's select H1s, H2s, and H3s. We don't have any H4s in there, so it doesn't really matter. And I think what we want to set this to is a margin top of 10 pixels and a margin bottom of 20 pixels. So let's hit save. Now you can see those are breaking off away from the text. We need to style the paragraph text now, and that's going to be a little bit smaller. So we'll say for paragraph elements, we want just the margin bottom to be 15 pixels. Now you can see those are spaced out pretty well. At the bottom, the sidebar doesn't have any padding, so we also need to set that. We'll just try the same exact styles that we did wherever we did them. It's getting to be a big CSS file now. So we put that on main. So maybe let's take this off of main here and bring it up into the shared styles. So we'll say main and the aside will both have that padding. So now this comes in. This is padded, so we're looking pretty good. There's just one piece of content missing still, and that's the footer. So let's go into the footer. I'm just going to paste in the attribution. Would really appreciate it if you kept that there so other people can discover this tutorial. The text color on this is a little bit wrong, so what we can do is set the paragraph elements of the footer to be white text. So let me grab another section here. Once again, we'll come right above those media queries. And this will be the footer styles, which will be pretty easy. So we'll say footer p tags are going to get a color of white. So now that text goes to white, this stays green, and then of course we need to change the background color on the footer. So for now, let's just set something there. We need to delete the footer's background color of orange, and then let's see what in the style guide we've given the footer background color right here. And actually, we've already set this actually. So now that we deleted that, this one at the top here, so header and footer background color, this should apply. So now that's looking good, and finally we can set the footer. We can set this to be a flex container. Then we can justify content center and align items center. Now the created by ZG Dev is kind of centered, but it's a little bit above there because p tags are getting some margin. So we just want to set this to a margin of 0. And now it is perfectly centered in the footer. And finally, just to get some bounds on everything, in the final version, you'll see this line here separating the nav bar and then this line on top of this sidebar. So I want to do the same thing here. So we'll come to the nav styles and we'll set a border right of 1 pixel, solid, and then RGBA, we'll just give it a color of black and an opacity of 0.1 or 10%. So there's that line. Looks good. Then we need the sidebar. So this is only going to be one style, but I might as well keep everything organized. So we'll set the aside to have a border top of that same thing, so what we just set. Now if we remove the background on that, which we can do up here somewhere, so we'll get rid of these two. That's gone, and where's our border top? Oh, of course, because I just gave it a color. I need to give it 1 pixel solid. Kind of running out of steam here, but we're getting close. So there's your border top. And then, of course, this is only going to apply for mobile and tablet devices. But once we break this sidebar right here, and it goes up to the top, we don't really need that border. So what we can say is down in this media query, we want the aside to have a border of none. So now that's not going to have a border when it gets bigger and it breaks to the side. Okay, let's pop this open and see what is left. So obviously we have these images right here. We're going to eventually put them into a mosaic type layout, and we're going to use CSS Grid for that. It'll be pretty fun to do. Looks like we need a divider over here. Then we also need the pictures to be rounded with a little drop shadow on them. Let's first take care of this. We need a border to the left on that sidebar when it is bigger. So I actually misspoke when I said we need a border of none. We do need a border. It just needs to be on a different side of the element. So let's put in our 0.1, and instead of just border, we'll say border left. So now there's that left border. We'll fix the images too. So this will be a shared style. So we'll go to the top and put that somewhere. So images will be, get a border radius of 5 pixels, and then a box shadow. We'll just go with 1 pixel across the board, and then a black color with 20% opacity. So there's that rounded corners and a little bit of a drop shadow. And I actually miswrote this, so let's put in a different box shadow. A little bit different, 2 pixels, 3 pixels. I think that looks a little better. All right, I think the last thing we're doing is this mosaic, and then everything else is pretty much complete here. If we resize this, everything's working kind of as expected. There is one thing happening here, so it looks like the picture is breaking off of the screen. So to fix that, in our global image styles, we need to set a max width of 100% of its container. And now that's not going to break off. It's going to resize as that, outer container resizes. But other than that, let's get these images into a mosaic. All right, we can get rid of the style guide down here. Let's bring the styles.css here and split downward so we have some more room, and make this bigger. All right, so I got a slightly new view here. We've got the index.html on the top here, and then styles.css. Now we need to take these 3 images and turn them into something like this. Now don't worry about the images themselves, those are randomized. We just want this layout right here. When you copied in the content for the article, you should have already copied in the container. So what I did here was I created a container that we are calling a class of collage, and then we give each image an individual class that we can target it with. These images are by default going to be 300 by 400, 300 by 500, and then 3 by 400. So the middle one is that taller one, and the 2 on the side are going to be equal. So our first step in solving this is to make ourselves a little section. So right above breakpoints, we will say that we want the collage. We will select the class of its container and set it to display grid. And once we do that, those images are going to sit right on top of each other. Now if we look at this collage, it kind of looks like there's 3 columns, something like that, maybe 1 row. You'll be surprised how we're going to build this. I'm not going to really try to go really deep explaining how I came up with it, other than just a little bit of trial and error. So let me define the grid for us. We'll say grid template rows, and what we're going to do is give it 2 rows of 1 fractional unit each. So 2 equal rows, and then for the columns, we will give it 1 fractional unit, then 40 pixels, another fractional unit, another 40 pixels, and then the remaining space, 1 more fractional unit. I'm also going to give this grid container a height. So we know that the tallest picture is 500. So I think what I'm going to do is just give that a height of, say, 550 pixels. So when we click save, you'll see that, where'd we go? Okay, so we've got those 3, looks like 3 columns now, and the total height is 500. But if we open this up here and look at the grid, you'll see this a little better. So let's select the collage, and if we open up this pane and select the grid itself, here's the grid that we're working with, and I'll put on the lines so that you can really see where these pictures are going. So really what our goal here is to put this little guy, it's going to be much bigger once we give it a grid area. We want the middle tallest picture to take up from columns 2 to columns 5, and then the two side pictures will go from columns 1 to column 3. So it's kind of going to overlap that middle picture, and then likewise on the right side we want it to go from column 4 to column 6. Let's go back to our code here and start giving each of them a grid area. So we have collage 1, 2, and 3. Give that a grid area of, we'll say alias C1. And then we will just replace these with their appropriate numbers. Then we can come up, let me get this height at the top, get it out of our way, and say grid template areas. And we may actually not need 2 rows here. I think we only need 1 row. We may come back to that. But for our areas, since we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in order to do this with these lines, we're not going to use the grid template areas method. We're just going to come in and say grid column start. Yep, I think that's it. And we'll say 1 for the first one, and grid column end will be 3. So like I said, this first image is going to go from column 1 to 3. Then we're going to take the middle image from 2 to 5. So we'll drop that in there. So there's our middle image going from 2 to 5. And then finally this one will go from 4 to 6. All right, let's hit save on that. These are obviously stacking on top of each other now, and we don't want that. So by default, since they're kind of overlapping, they're going to stack, but we can override this behavior. All we have to do is select everything, so collage 1, 2, and 3. So we could list these out, collage-1, collage-2, blah, blah, blah. Or we could just say, let's take the parent container and select all the descendants. And then we'll say grid row start will be 1, and grid row end will be 2, since we have just 1 row. We'll hit save there, and now they are jumping up on the right spot. Let's get rid of the line numbers and the area names. What you'll notice here is that our overlap is not working correctly. So these two are correct, but this third one should be underneath that middle one. All we have to do for that is set the z index. So the z index for 1 and 3 is going to be 1. This is just arbitrary. You could set it to whatever you want, as long as the z index of 2 is greater than that of 1 and 3. So now the middle one's sitting on top of those two on the left and right. You can see they're all hugging the top side of this container. We want to center them so they're all kind of on that same horizontal axis. To do that, if we go to our CSS and go to the main container, we can say, what do we want to do? We want to say align items center. And now they're sitting on top of each other just like that. Okay, at this point we can kind of shrink this down. Don't need that anymore. At this point it's getting hard to tell which one's the final and which one is the one that we just did, which is a good thing. But this is what we're working on right now. And the last thing we need to do is get those two on the left and right to kind of tilt themselves outward. And this is actually easier than you might think. All you do is come down to the first item and you say transform, and you can pass many different functions to this, but one of them is rotate. And we can say, I think what I did here was 3 degrees, so -3 degrees, so we'll rotate it that way, counterclockwise. Then we'll take this same property and we'll put it on collage number 3, and we'll do a +3 degrees. So when we click save, you'll see these kind of go outward. And there we go. And the last thing we'll do is put a bigger drop shadow on this middle one. So you'll see that this middle one has a more pronounced drop shadow that kind of pushes it off the background a little bit. I'll go ahead and just copy that in. So we'll come to collage number 2 and paste in a box shadow that's got a little bit bigger and less transparent colors. So there it is. Since we didn't see that, let me comment it out. So there's before and there is after. So it's kind of jumping out from the screen. And as we resize it, everything looks pretty good. We can toggle the nav back and forth, scroll down to the footer. If we toggle the nav there and scroll down to the footer, it gets pushed over. That's good. Then as we make it larger, everything looks great. So congratulations for making it through this tutorial. Hope you enjoyed building this project, and this is gonna help you walk away with some really valuable skills, especially with the CSS grid layouts. And you will be making this again in your career. This is a very common layout, so that's why I picked it, and hopefully you enjoyed it. The last step is to get this deployed to GitHub Pages, which will be relatively simple. We just open up Visual Studio Code. We'll get all these files closed out. So our files are ready, and all we need to do is come to the source control and click this little, or actually we need to stage all of our changes first. So we have to click this plus button. So here's all of our staged changes. Then we have to click the check and we'll say finish project, hit enter. And I believe that committed it and pushed it up to our repository if I'm remembering correctly. Actually, I misspoke here. So what we just did, and I apologize, I usually don't use Visual Studio Code. I usually come down into the terminal and just write things like git add all. That's what we just did when we staged it. Then git commit, add a message, so finish project, and then we'd hit enter. And then finally we would say git push origin master, and that's going to push it up to the master branch of our remote GitHub repository. Once again, I have another video on that, and we're going to cover it later in the series, so don't worry about that right now. But the last thing we need to do, since we staged the changes with the plus, we committed them with that check mark. Now we just have to hit these 3 dots and click push or pull, and we need to push to, click origin, and I think that's going to push it up to our repository. Now if we go check that out and refresh, you'll see that there was a push 2 minutes ago. Well, I don't know why it's 2 minutes ago, but all of our files are here, and now the last thing we need to do is get it over to GitHub Pages. So you just click master, and then you'll just type in GitHub Pages, and since I already have it as GitHub Pages, I have to do a little bit different process, but you'll just type gh-pages and then click create branch, and it will create the GitHub Pages branch from all of this code. And then you can come down into the environments, click GitHub Pages, and view the deployment, and that will bring you to the link that you need to view your project.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the CSS Grid course. I hope you learned a lot, and be sure to check the video description for some additional resources and maybe some next steps. If you liked this video, if you learned anything, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Until next time, I'll see you later.